High in the mountains between Rome and Persia stood a kingdom neither empire could afford to ignore. Armenia was invaded, divided, burned, and forced to place foreign-backed kings on its throne. Yet every time one empire believed it had finally taken control, the mountains seemed to push back. Rome sent legions, Persia sent cavalry. Kings were betrayed, cities were destroyed, and an entire kingdom was split between two superpowers. But Armenia did not disappear. Before we uncover how this mountain kingdom survived centuries between two giants, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy ancient history, lost kingdoms, and the mysteries of the past. The first thing an army notices about Armenia is the climb. Roads narrow into stony passes, river valleys twist between walls of dark rock, and the horizon rises into ridges where snow can remain long after spring has reached the plains below. To the west lie routes toward Anatolia and the Mediterranean world. To the east stretch the approaches to Iran and the great empires of the Iranian plateau. Southward, roads descend toward Mesopotamia. Northward, the Caucasus forms another broken frontier of mountains and peoples. Armenia sits in the middle of all of it, on elevated ground between powers that repeatedly reach the same conclusion: whoever controls these highlands can threaten the roads and kingdoms beyond them. This is the central danger of the mountain kingdom. Rome looks east and sees Armenia as a shield, a corridor, and sometimes a problem. Persian rulers look west and see much the same. Neither side treats the Armenian highlands as a distant wilderness. The land is too strategically placed, its nobles too connected to neighbouring courts, its cavalry too useful, and its routes too important. Yet Armenia is not an empty board on which two empires move pieces. It has its own rulers, aristocratic families, traditions, fortified settlements, and deeply rooted populations. The kingdom that emerges here learns a difficult political skill. Survival does not always mean defeating stronger enemies. Sometimes it means persuading two stronger enemies that destroying you would cost more than keeping you alive. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the landscape helps explain why Armenia can survive at all. The Armenian highlands form a rugged zone of volcanic plateaus, mountain chains, deep valleys, and high basins. Rivers rise in or near these uplands, while routes through the region connect Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and Iran. Lake Van lies amid mountains in the south, and farther north the Araxes Valley becomes a corridor. Winter's close passes. Snow isolates communities. Steep terrain punishes large armies and complicates supply, but the region also contains fertile valleys, pasture, mineral resources, and defensible positions. An invader may enter Armenia with confidence and discover that conquering a road is not the same as controlling the mountains around it. Ancient powers understood the value of this high country long before Rome arrived in the east. Assyrian kings campaigned toward the uplands. The kingdom known to modern historians as Urartu built fortresses, canals, and administrative centers across parts of the region in the first millennium BCE. Later, the Achaemenid Persian Empire incorporated Armenian territories into its imperial structure. What survives in the record suggests a region connected to larger political systems, while retaining strong local traditions and elite networks. The precise development of Armenian identity remains a subject of scholarly debate, especially when historians connect language, archaeology, and the names used by foreign sources. The evidence remains incomplete. Ancient identities rarely form in the clean way modern maps encourage people to imagine. By the time Rome becomes deeply involved in Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean, the region is already politically crowded. Kingdoms rise between greater imperial spheres, dynasties marry across borders, Greek culture has spread through cities and courts after Alexander and his successors, Iranian political traditions remain influential. Local aristocracies control land and retain armed followers. Armenia belongs to several worlds at once. This mixed position becomes one of its greatest strengths and one of its most persistent vulnerabilities. To a Roman commander arriving from the west, Armenia can appear distant and severe. Roman power has grown around the Mediterranean, supported by roads, cities, maritime connections, and expanding provincial networks. The farther east Rome pushes, the more complicated the political terrain becomes. Here Rome encounters monarchies shaped by older traditions of imperial diplomacy. Beyond Armenia lies Parthia, a major Iranian power capable of challenging Roman armies and famous for mobile cavalry warfare. Armenia stands between them like a gate built into a mountain wall. But gates can open in both directions. For the Parthians, and later the Sasanians, Armenia offers access toward Anatolia and the Roman East. A friendly Armenian king can provide strategic depth. A hostile one can expose a dangerous flank. Armenian cavalry and noble houses may become valuable partners, while the highlands themselves can serve as a buffer. This is why the identity of the Armenian king matters far beyond his own kingdom. His marriage alliances matter. Even the court in which he has spent his youth can become an imperial concern. The geography is already pushing events toward intervention. Armenia is too difficult to absorb casually, but too important to ignore. That combination will shape centuries of history. The people living in the highlands experience this importance in a less abstract way. Imperial rivalry means taxes, requisitions, burned crops, shifting loyalties, and foreign soldiers on roads that had recently carried merchants and herders. Noble families may gain influence by supporting one power and lose estates when the balance changes. A fortress that protects a valley in one generation becomes the target of a siege in the next. Decisions made by emperors and kings echo into mountain communities their rulers may never see. And yet Armenia is not permanently passive. Its rulers will sometimes exploit the rivalry with remarkable skill. At moments, the kingdom expands far beyond its mountain heartland. At others, it is reduced or forced into compromise. Armenian kings will change alliances, resist invasions, and occasionally misjudge their powerful neighbours with catastrophic results. No single explanation fully accounts for Armenia's repeated survival. Geography helps, but mountains alone do not create political endurance. Diplomacy helps, but diplomacy can fail. Aristocratic networks preserve continuity, yet they also create division. That is what makes the Armenian story more than a tale of a small country crushed between empires. The closer the highlands are examined, the less passive the kingdom appears. Rome and Persia struggle over Armenia because Armenia itself has weight. It possesses land worth controlling, elites worth courting, and roots worth defending. Its rulers can alter the balance of the eastern frontier. Its choices can become matters of international consequence. For now, though, the mountain kingdom is still taking shape against a much older landscape. Beneath later Armenian fortresses lie memories of earlier states. Across the valleys stand routes used by armies before Roman legions ever looked east. The highlands have already watched empires rise, claim dominion, and disappear. Rome and Persia will enter this landscape believing they are history's great forces. The mountains, with long memory and difficult roads, will prove less easily impressed. Long before Armenian kings begin negotiating with Rome or Persia, other rulers have already learned how difficult these highlands are to govern. Their traces remain in walls built from massive blocks of stone, in inscriptions cut into cliffs, and in channels that once carried water across dry slopes toward fields and settlements. The mountains preserve ruins with unusual stubbornness. kingdoms disappear, languages fall silent, and dynasties become names in damaged records. But foundations remain beneath later towns. In Armenia, the past is rarely buried very far below the present. One of the most powerful early states to dominate much of the region is the kingdom modern scholars call Urartu, beginning in the early 1st millennium BCE. Its kings establish a network of fortified centres around Lake Van and across broad parts of the Armenian highlands. Assyrian sources know the region through names connected with Urartu, while the Urartian kings leave their own inscriptions in a language distinct from Armenian. Their state is highly organised by the standards of the age. Royal inscriptions record military campaigns, building projects, vineyards, temples, and irrigation works. Fortresses rise on steep outcrops where the land itself becomes part of the defensive architecture. At sites such as Erebuni, founded in the 8th century BCE on a hill overlooking the Ararat Plain, walls and inscriptions reveal rulers concerned with more than simple military occupation. They create administrative centres, store grain, control labour, and reshape the surrounding landscape. A lesser-known feature of Urartian power is the extraordinary attention given to water. Canals carry mountain water over long distances, supporting agriculture in places where rainfall alone may be unreliable. Some irrigation systems associated with Urartian engineering continue to influence local land use for centuries. In a region famous for armies, one of the most enduring forms of power is the careful movement of water downhill. Yet Urartu is not Armenia in the later political or linguistic sense, and the relationship between the two has often been simplified. Scholars still debate how the populations of the highlands changed during the centuries between Urartu's decline and the emergence of clearly identifiable Armenian-speaking political communities. Archaeology shows continuity in many settlements and practices, but continuity does not mean that one kingdom simply changes its name. Languages can spread without entire populations disappearing. Elite identities can change while villages remain on the same land. New political structures can absorb older traditions. The evidence remains incomplete, and ancient people did not leave behind the kind of records that would satisfy modern arguments about national origins. What is clear is that the highlands never become empty. When Urartian royal power weakens in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, communities continue to live among its former territories. Fortresses may be abandoned or reused. Agricultural systems remain valuable. Older roads continue to guide movement because geography has not changed. The easiest pass through a mountain range does not become less useful simply because the king who once guarded it is dead. The Achaemenid Persian Empire eventually brings much of the region into a new imperial world. Persian rule is vast and flexible, linking lands from Central Asia to Egypt and the Aegean. Armenia appears within this structure as a territory associated with imperial tribute and military obligations. Greek writers later describe Armenians serving within Persian forces, and the region is connected to the network of roads and administrative relationships that sustain Achaemenid rule. Local elites likely retain significant influence so long as imperial demands are met. This pattern becomes familiar in Armenian history. A distant great power claims authority, but effective control depends heavily on cooperation with people who understand the valleys, noble families, and local loyalties. The highlands encourage this kind of divided power. A ruler may dominate a broad plain while another family holds a mountain district only a few days away. Communication slows in winter. Wealth is unevenly distributed. Some regions support farming and permanent settlements. Others depend more heavily on seasonal movement and grazing. Horses are particularly important. The Armenian highlands develop a reputation in ancient sources for horses and cavalry, resources that imperial powers value greatly. Control of horse-producing areas is not merely an economic advantage. In an age when mounted forces can decide campaigns, it has strategic consequences. The population itself is never culturally isolated. To the south lie the worlds of Mesopotamia and northern Syria. To the west are Anatolian kingdoms increasingly influenced by Greek culture. To the east stretch Iranian lands whose political and religious traditions will shape Armenian aristocratic society deeply. Northern connections lead toward the Caucasus. Gods, artistic styles, weapons, royal customs, and words move along the same routes as merchants and armies. This makes the early Armenian world difficult to reduce to one origin point. The Armenian language belongs to the Indo-European language family, yet the exact process by which Armenian speakers become dominant in the highlands is still debated. Some models emphasize migrations or population movements. Others stress long-term cultural and linguistic change within mixed communities. Genetic studies, archaeology, and linguistic evidence continue to refine the picture. But no single explanation fully accounts for every feature of the transition. What survives in the record suggests a gradual and complicated formation rather than a sudden appearance. By the later centuries of the first millennium BCE, however, outside observers increasingly recognize Armenia as a distinct region with its own rulers and people. Under the successors of Alexander the Great, the political map becomes even more fragmented. Alexander's conquests destroy the Achaemenid imperial system, but his empire does not remain united. Generals and dynasties fight over its territories. Greek-speaking courts appear across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Cities adopt Hellenistic styles. Coins and royal imagery circulate widely. Yet in Armenia, local dynastic power remains resilient. The Orontid dynasty, known through Greek sources and connected to older Iranian political traditions, rules parts of Armenia during this changing period. Their origins and exact chronology are not always clear, and historians continue to reconstruct their position from scattered evidence. They appear as regional rulers operating within larger imperial systems, first under Persian influence and later amid the struggles of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Their story reveals an important habit already forming in Armenian politics. Local dynasties survive by adapting to changes above them. A new empire may arrive, but it still needs taxes collected, it still needs roads watched, it still needs soldiers and horses, it still needs someone to negotiate with powerful families in districts where a foreign official may know neither the language nor the terrain. This gives local rulers leverage, though never complete security. Across the highlands, social power is increasingly tied to aristocratic families whose authority rests on land, armed followers, and inherited status. Later, Armenian history will become famous for its powerful noble houses, and although the fully developed system belongs to later centuries, its roots lie in these older regional structures. Kingship in Armenia is rarely absolute in the way royal propaganda might suggest. A king must manage men who control fortresses and valleys of their own. The mountains that protect Armenia therefore also divide it. They make conquest difficult, but they make unity difficult as well. This contradiction will return repeatedly. Foreign armies struggle to hold the land, while Armenian rulers struggle to bind its powerful regions into a single durable state. By the 2nd century BCE, centuries of Eurasian foundations, Persian imperial influence, Hellenistic contact, local dynasties, and highland aristocratic networks have created something politically new. Armenia is no longer simply a distant province described by stronger neighbours. The outlines of a more independent kingdom are becoming visible. Its people have inherited roads from vanished states, fortresses from forgotten builders, and political traditions from several imperial worlds. The landscape has not changed. The mountains still rise between east and west, but the rulers who are about to take control of them will begin to think on a much larger scale. The political change begins quietly enough, through the weakening of another empire. In the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid kingdom, one of the great successor states born from Alexander's conquests, is losing its grip over distant territories. Its rulers still claim enormous lands, but claims on maps become less useful when governors, local dynasts, and military commanders realize that the center can no longer enforce obedience everywhere at once. In Armenia, 2 figures emerge from this uncertainty: Artaxias and Zariadres. Ancient sources connect them to Seleucid authority before they establish independent rule in different Armenian regions. The exact details remain debated, but the larger pattern is clear. A moment of imperial weakness creates space for ambitious local rulers, and Armenia begins to move from fragmented highland power toward a more coherent kingdom. Artaxias becomes the more important of the two. His rise marks the beginning of the Artaxiad dynasty, a ruling house that will transform Armenia's political position. Instead of merely surviving as a peripheral territory beneath larger empires, Armenia starts developing the institutions and ambitions of an independent state. This does not happen overnight. The mountains remain divided by geography and noble interests, and neighbouring powers remain dangerous. Yet Artaxias appears to understand that independence requires more than a crown. It requires territory, administration, and a centre from which royal power can reach outward. One of his most significant acts is the foundation, or major development, of Artaxata on the Araxes River. The city occupies a strategic position in the fertile Ararat plain, close to important routes linking different parts of the highlands. Later tradition associates the site with the Carthaginian commander Hannibal, who is said to have advised Artaxias on the city's location. The story is famous, but the evidence remains uncertain, and scholars still debate how much historical value should be given to the tradition. Hannibal did spend his final years moving among eastern courts after his defeat by Rome, so the idea is not impossible. Even so, no single source allows the episode to be treated as established fact. What matters more is the city itself. Artaxata becomes a royal centre designed for a kingdom that intends to endure, situated near the river and protected by the surrounding geography. It connects royal authority to trade and agriculture. Cities in the ancient world are not simply places where people live. They are tools of government. A capital concentrates officials, wealth, storage, religious institutions, and military command. It gives a dynasty a visible heart. Artaxias also expands his influence across Armenian lands, though reconstructing the exact boundaries of his kingdom is difficult. Ancient accounts suggest military campaigns and territorial consolidation. Inscriptions and later traditions point toward efforts to define estates and royal land. Stone boundary markers bearing Aramaic inscriptions have been connected with Artaxias and may reflect attempts to organize property or establish clearer divisions of land. This is a surprisingly practical trace of state formation. Empires are often remembered through battles, but governments become durable through less dramatic acts measuring fields, recording ownership, and deciding where one man's authority ends and another's begins. The choice of Aramaic for such inscriptions reveals the cultural complexity of the kingdom. Armenian is spoken, but the Armenian alphabet does not yet exist. Administrative practices draw on older Near Eastern traditions. Iranian influences remain strong among elites, while Hellenistic culture increasingly shapes royal display and urban life. Coins, architecture, and court customs tie Armenia to broader regional systems. The Artaxiad kingdom is not culturally sealed within its mountains. It is becoming stronger precisely because it can absorb several traditions without losing its own political center. This flexibility extends to religion. Ancient Armenian religious life includes local deities and cult practices, but many gods are understood through Iranian and Hellenistic parallels. Temples become places not only of worship but also of wealth and political authority. Priestly families can hold influence, and sacred centers may control land. The religious landscape reflects centuries of contact, adaptation, and reinterpretation. Later attempts to draw sharp boundaries between Armenian, Persian, and Greek traditions often fail to capture how blended this world actually is. Artaxias rules a kingdom that must still negotiate with powerful neighbours. To the west and south, Hellenistic states compete for territory. To the east, Parthia is rising from a regional power into a major empire. Rome is not yet the constant presence it will become in Armenian affairs. But Roman influence is moving steadily eastward through wars in the Mediterranean and Anatolia. Armenia's independence is real. Yet it is born during a period when the entire political order of the Near East is shifting. The strength of the Artaxiad state lies partly in its ability to exploit that instability. Larger kingdoms are distracted by their own conflicts. Armenia has time to consolidate. Royal authority reaches farther across the highlands. Trade routes connect the kingdom to surrounding regions, and agricultural valleys provide resources for the court and army. Horses and mounted warriors remain especially valuable. Armenian forces increasingly reflect the military traditions of the Iranian world, where heavily armed cavalry can play a decisive role. But beneath royal expansion, the old problem of the mountains remains. The king does not rule an empty landscape filled with obedient subjects. Powerful families possess local influence and armed retainers. Some districts are remote. Personal loyalty matters as much as written administration. A ruler who fails to manage the aristocracy may discover that a distant valley has become effectively independent before news reaches the capital. This tension between royal power and noble autonomy becomes one of the defining features of Armenian political history. The Artaxiads strengthen the monarchy, but they cannot erase the social structures that existed before them. Instead, they work through those structures. Alliances, marriages, grants of land, and military obligations bind noble houses to the crown. Success depends on balance. Too little royal authority produces fragmentation. Too much pressure risks rebellion. The surprising achievement of Artaxias is that he appears to hold enough of this system together to create a stable platform for his successors. Armenia is no longer merely reacting to outside powers. It is beginning to act. The kingdom has a dynasty, a capital, an expanding territorial identity, and a political elite increasingly connected to the idea of Armenian kingship. Yet state formation creates ambition. Once rulers control a secure highland base, the valleys beyond the mountains begin to look less like distant lands and more like opportunities. The roads descending toward Mesopotamia carry wealth. Northern Syria holds prosperous cities. Anatolia is divided among competing kingdoms. The Seleucids continue to weaken, and Parthia has its own concerns in the east. For a generation, Armenia has escaped imperial control because stronger neighbours are distracted. The lesson could have been caution. Instead, under one extraordinary Artaxiad ruler, the kingdom will draw a far more dangerous conclusion. If great empires can weaken, then perhaps Armenia does not have to remain between them. Perhaps it can become one of them. The ruler who reaches that conclusion is Tigranes II, remembered more commonly as Tigranes the Great. His rise changes the scale of Armenian history so quickly that later generations can almost mistake the expansion for inevitability. It is not. Armenia remains a highland kingdom surrounded by stronger traditions of imperial rule, and Tigranes himself begins his career under the shadow of Parthia. Ancient accounts suggest that he spends time at the Parthian court as a hostage, probably as a guarantee of Armenian political loyalty. The precise circumstances remain uncertain, but what survives in the record suggests a young ruler who learns early how great powers control weaker neighbours. He sees imperial diplomacy from the inside, he also sees its weaknesses. When Tigranes takes the Armenian throne around the beginning of the 1st century BCE, he does not inherit a peaceful region. The Seleucid kingdom is collapsing under dynastic conflict. Parthia is powerful, but periodically distracted by eastern threats and internal succession struggles. Smaller kingdoms across Anatolia, the Caucasus, and northern Mesopotamia compete for survival. Rome is increasingly active in the eastern Mediterranean but has not yet imposed a stable order across the entire region. For an ambitious king, the political landscape resembles a wall filled with widening cracks. Tigranes moves quickly. He begins by consolidating Armenian territories and then pushing outward. Regions long contested by neighbouring powers fall under his influence. Armenian armies advance south and east, while alliances extend his political reach farther than force alone could achieve. His marriage to Cleopatra, daughter of Mithridates VI of Pontus, connects Armenia to one of Rome's most determined enemies. Mithridates is a gifted and relentless ruler who has built his own power around the Black Sea and challenged Roman expansion in Anatolia. The marriage creates more than a family connection. It links two monarchies that see opportunity in Rome's unfinished conquest of the East. Tigranes does not simply follow Mithridates. His ambitions are his own. At the height of his power, Armenian influence stretches from the Caucasus toward northern Mesopotamia and Syria. Ancient sources describe kings and regional rulers acknowledging his supremacy. Some call him a king of kings, a title deeply connected to Iranian imperial traditions. The phrase is not modest, but modesty is rarely the purpose of royal titles. It communicates hierarchy. Tigranes is presenting himself not merely as king of Armenia, but as the ruler above other rulers. One of the clearer signs of this new ambition is the creation of Tigranokerta, a royal capital intended to reflect imperial scale. Its exact archaeological identification has long been debated, and several locations have been proposed, though many scholars place it in the region of modern southeastern Turkey. The uncertainty itself is a reminder of how incomplete the evidence remains. Ancient writers describe a splendid city populated by people moved from different regions of the expanding kingdom. Greek craftsmen, merchants, and urban populations are said to have been resettled there, sometimes forcibly. This is a familiar imperial technique. New capitals need people. People create markets, workshops, tax revenue, and cultural prestige. By concentrating populations from conquered cities, Tigranes can weaken potential centres of resistance while strengthening his own royal city. The human experience behind such policies is far less impressive than the monuments they produce. Families are removed from familiar streets and fields. Artisans rebuild their lives under a new ruler. Merchants establish networks because there may be no easy path home. Imperial cities often appear in history as symbols of glory, but their foundations can be filled with displacement. Tigranokerta reflects the mixed world Tigranes rules. Hellenistic urban culture shapes the court and city, while Iranian traditions influence royal ceremony and political titles. Armenian power provides the military foundation. Greek actors and intellectuals may appear at court. Coins present the king wearing a distinctive Armenian tiara decorated with royal symbols. His image is carefully constructed. He is not hiding the kingdom's highland origin. Yet he's speaking in a visual language understood across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The speed of the expansion is remarkable. Around 83 BCE, Tigranes takes control of Syria after local political factions, exhausted by Seleucid dynastic chaos, accept or invite his authority. For roughly a decade, Armenian rule extends over one of the richest regions of the Near East. Cities that had once belonged to the Seleucid imperial heartland now answer to a king from the Armenian highlands. From the perspective of Artaxias only a few generations earlier, the transformation would have been almost unimaginable. Yet the empire contains a contradiction from the beginning. Armenia's strength is still rooted in its highland core, but Tigranes now governs lowland territories far beyond those mountains. Syria, parts of Mesopotamia, and regions near the Mediterranean have different political traditions and economic systems. They contain wealthy cities accustomed to complex administration and long histories of changing rulers. Holding these places requires permanent military force, loyal officials, and reliable communication. Tigranes has conquered during a moment of regional weakness. The question is whether the moment will last. His military power is considerable. Armenian and allied forces include cavalry influenced by Iranian warfare, especially heavily armoured mounted troops later known broadly as cataphracts. Horse and rider may be protected by armour, creating a powerful striking force on open ground. Like cavalry and infantry from different territories add numbers and variety. Ancient sources sometimes give enormous figures for Tigranes' armies, but such totals should be treated cautiously. Classical historians frequently exaggerate enemy numbers, especially when explaining dramatic victories. The true scale remains uncertain. Even without the inflated totals, Tigranes commands enough force to dominate neighbouring kingdoms. His court attracts dependent rulers and envoys. Tribute and wealth flow toward the centre. Armenia reaches the greatest territorial extent in its known ancient history. For a brief period, the mountain kingdom is no longer trapped between empires. It has become the empire others must consider. The change can be felt in the political language of the region. Parthia, once the power capable of holding an Armenian prince as a hostage, loses territories and influence to Tigranes. The remnants of Seleucid authority shrink. Smaller rulers calculate their positions relative to Armenia. Even Rome cannot ignore the new kingdom, though Roman leaders are initially occupied elsewhere. The dangerous connection remains Mithridates of Pontus. His wars against Rome continue, driven by rivalry, Roman expansion, and the unstable politics of Anatolia. Tigranes tries at times to separate his own interests from those of his father-in-law. He has built too much to risk everything in another king's conflict. But family alliances are not easily dismissed when defeated rulers need refuge. In 71 BCE, after suffering reverses against the Roman commander Lucullus, Mithridates flees to Armenia. Tigranes receives him but reportedly avoids meeting him immediately. The detail, preserved in ancient narrative, may reflect later dramatic shaping, yet it captures the political problem perfectly. Refusing Mithridates could appear weak and disloyal. Protecting him risks confrontation with Rome. Tigranes has spent decades exploiting the gaps between great powers. Now one of those powers has followed his ally to the edge of the Armenian world. From the west comes a military system unlike the divided Seleucid kingdoms he has defeated. Roman commanders are aggressive, politically ambitious, and supported by legions hardened through repeated war. They do not look at Tigranes' empire and see a permanent Eastern order. They see territories gained during chaos, an enemy king sheltering Rome's opponent, and a monarch whose titles have grown dangerously large. The Highland Kingdom has risen higher than ever before. That only means the fall, if it comes, will be visible from farther away. Rome does not enter Armenia as a curious visitor. It arrives chasing an enemy and carrying the habits of a republic that has spent generations turning temporary wars into permanent frontiers. Lucullus, the Roman commander pursuing Mithridates, demands that Tigranes surrender the fugitive king. Tigranes refuses. Ancient writers later decorate the exchange with the arrogance expected of Eastern monarchs and the stern resolve expected of Roman generals. But beneath the literary performance lies a simple strategic fact. Rome has asked the Armenian king to prove that his empire exists only with Roman permission. Tigranes cannot agree without weakening the authority he has spent decades constructing. Lucullus invades Armenia in 69 BCE. The decision is bold enough to alarm some of his own officers, Roman armies have campaigned far from Italy before, but Armenia presents a different problem. The routes are long, the terrain unfamiliar, and the enemy rules from a highland base beyond established Roman possessions. Lucullus moves quickly, apparently hoping to prevent Tigranes from gathering the full military resources of his empire. Speed has served Roman commanders well in other campaigns. In Armenia, it also reduces the time available for defenders to close passes or strip the countryside of supplies. Tigranes initially seems surprised by the advance. His empire has grown accustomed to enemies retreating or submitting. Roman legions, however, continue toward Tigranokerta, the new royal capital built as a monument to Armenian imperial power. The city now becomes the place where that power is tested. Tigranes gathers an army. Ancient sources describe an enormous multinational force, with cavalry, infantry, and contingents from across his territories. The numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. Roman historians have a long tradition of making enemy armies vast enough to make Roman victories appear miraculous. Scholars still debate the realistic size of the forces involved, and the evidence remains incomplete. What can be said with more confidence is that Tigranes commands a diverse army drawn from a rapidly assembled empire, while Lucullus leads experienced troops accustomed to fighting together under a disciplined command structure. The battle outside Tigranocerta becomes one of the most famous moments of Tigranes' reign. Armenian heavy cavalry appears formidable, especially on terrain suitable for a mounted charge, but Lucullus maneuvers aggressively. Roman troops attack positions associated with the cavalry and exploit weaknesses in the Armenian formation. The exact sequence is difficult to reconstruct from sources written with Roman audiences in mind, yet the outcome is not disputed. Tigranes is defeated. The collapse is severe enough that Tigranocerta itself soon falls. Some of the city's forcibly resettled inhabitants reportedly assist the Romans or abandon their loyalty to the Armenian king. This is one of the darker consequences of Tigranes' method of empire building. Populations moved into a royal capital may create wealth and grandeur, but they do not necessarily create loyalty. When the political structure supporting their relocation breaks, the city reveals how shallow imperial unity can be. For Rome, the victory is spectacular. For Tigranes, it exposes a weakness that had been hidden by years of expansion. His empire is large but young. Its distant territories have not been bound together through centuries of administration. Some regions accepted Armenian rule because the Seleucids were collapsing. Others submitted to military pressure. The loyalty of dependent rulers can disappear as quickly as it appeared. Yet Tigranes does not surrender. This is where Armenia's geography begins to alter the war. The loss of a capital and a major battle would destroy many rulers. Tigranes retreats into the highlands, where the Roman advantages become less decisive. Lucullus advances deeper, eventually moving toward Artaxata, the older Armenian centre. The roads stretch longer. Weather worsens. Supplies become harder to obtain. Roman soldiers who have followed their commander through years of campaigning are increasingly exhausted. Mithridates is also still alive. The war that brought Lucullus east has not ended. Tigranes and Mithridates can rebuild forces, avoid decisive destruction, and make Rome pay for every additional mile of advance. Roman victories continue to matter, but they no longer produce the political collapse Lucullus expects. A campaign in Armenia reveals the difference between winning battles and controlling a mountain kingdom. Large imperial armies consume astonishing quantities of food. Soldiers require grain. Animals need fodder. Equipment wears out. Messages must travel back through dangerous territory. A commander moving deeper into hostile country depends on a supply system stretching behind him like a fragile cord. In the Armenian highlands, mountains and severe weather pull at that cord constantly. Lucullus's soldiers begin to resist further campaigning. Roman armies are disciplined, but they are not machines. Many troops believe they have served beyond reasonable terms. They have already fought Mithridates across Anatolia and marched far into the east. When Lucullus attempts to continue operations, discontent approaches mutiny. Political enemies in Rome also attack his position. Command in the late Roman Republic is never separated from personal rivalry. Victories can make a general famous, but prolonged wars create opportunities for rivals to replace him. Tigranes survives because Rome's military strength is constrained by Roman politics and by the physical limits of campaigning. This does not restore his empire. Syria slips away. Territories once held under Armenian supremacy regain independence or fall under other powers. The title of King of Kings sounds less convincing after Roman legions have marched through the royal domains, but Armenia itself remains unconquered. Lucullus's command eventually ends, and a new Roman figure enters the Eastern War. Pompey arrives with broad authority and enormous political ambition. Unlike Lucullus, Pompey benefits from a moment when Mithridates is increasingly isolated. In 66 BCE, he defeats Mithridates and forces him to flee northward. Tigranes now faces a much more dangerous situation. His old ally can no longer provide strategic balance, and internal problems are weakening the Armenian royal house. Tigranes' own son rebels against him. The younger Tigranes seeks support from Parthia, whose rulers have not forgotten the territories and prestige lost during Armenia's rise. A Parthian army invades Armenia in cooperation with the rebellious prince. The siege of Artasata fails, but the episode reveals how quickly regional politics have reversed. Tigranes the Great once intimidated neighbouring kings. Now Parthia and Rome both have reasons to influence his succession. The younger Tigranes eventually turns to Pompey. For the Roman commander, the dispute is a perfect opportunity. Rome does not need to conquer every fortress if Armenian dynastic conflict can bring the king to negotiation. In 66 BCE, the elderly Tigranes approaches Pompey's camp and submits. Ancient sources describe a highly theatrical meeting in which he removes symbols of royal status before the Roman commander restores some of his dignity. The details may have been shaped to flatter Pompey, but the political settlement is clear. Tigranes gives up his conquests beyond Armenia and pays a substantial indemnity. In return, he remains king of Armenia and is recognized as a friend and ally of Rome. The empire is gone. The kingdom survives. This compromise reveals the limits faced by both sides. Tigranes cannot defeat Rome and restore his wider dominion. Pompey, despite his victories, does not turn the Armenian highlands into an ordinary Roman province. Keeping Tigranes on the throne is cheaper and strategically useful. Armenia can serve as a friendly kingdom between Roman territory and Parthia. Rome has reached the mountains and broken an Armenian empire. It has not erased the Armenian monarchy. The lesson is noticed by rulers on every side. Direct conquest is possible. Permanent control is another matter. From this point onward, Armenia's throne becomes increasingly valuable, not because its kings can dominate Syria, but because the kingdom sits precisely where Rome and the Iranian world meet. Tigranes once dreamed of escaping the space between great powers by becoming a great power himself. His defeat ends that dream. The Armenia that remains must learn a subtler and more dangerous form of survival. It must learn to stand between giants without leaning so far toward one that the other decides to strike. After the settlement with Pompey, Armenia enters a world in which weakness must be concealed behind ceremony. The king still wears a crown. Armenian nobles still command estates and armed followers. The mountain fortresses remain difficult to take, and the old royal cities continue to function. Yet everyone at court understands that the kingdom's freedom is now measured against two expanding systems of power. Rome controls much of Anatolia and Syria. Parthia dominates the Iranian plateau and large parts of Mesopotamia. Between them, Armenia has become strategically valuable precisely because neither empire wants the other to possess it completely. This creates a strange kind of opportunity. A kingdom trapped between rivals can be crushed by both. It can also survive by ensuring that neither rival feels safe enough to finish the conquest. Armenian rulers begin to rely increasingly on a political language understood across the ancient world: marriages, hostages, dynastic recognition, and carefully calculated loyalty. These tools may appear less dramatic than battlefield victories, but they can decide the fate of kingdoms. A royal daughter sent to marry a foreign prince carries more than jewelry and servants. She carries a political connection. A young Armenian noble raised at another court becomes both guest and guarantee. A treaty confirmed through family ties can delay invasion, though rarely forever. Tigranes himself had already demonstrated the power of dynastic marriage through his connection to Mithridates of Pontus. The alliance helped strengthen Armenia's regional position, then helped drag the kingdom into Rome's war. The lesson is not that marriage diplomacy fails. The lesson is that every alliance creates obligations, and obligations become dangerous when the political balance changes. After Tigranes the Great dies around 55 BCE, his son Artavasdes II inherits this difficult system. Artavasdes is an intriguing figure, remembered in ancient tradition as an educated ruler who composed works in Greek. None of these writings survive, and the evidence for his literary activity comes from later authors. But the details suggest the cultural character of the Armenian court. This is a monarchy rooted in the highlands yet deeply connected to the Hellenistic intellectual world. A king may discuss Greek drama while negotiating with Parthian cavalry commanders and Roman envoys. Cultural identity and political loyalty do not fit into simple categories. Artavasdes inherits a kingdom that Rome considers an ally. In theory, this should provide security. In practice, Roman friendship can be extremely demanding. The Roman Republic is entering its final period of internal crisis. Powerful commanders compete for wealth, military glory, and political dominance. Eastern kingdoms become sources of troops, supplies, and strategic support. When Marcus Licinius Crassus prepares his invasion of Parthia in 54 BCE, he expects assistance from Armenia. Artavasdes offers cavalry and reportedly advises Crassus to invade through Armenia, where the terrain could reduce the effectiveness of Parthian mounted forces. The exact conversations are preserved through Roman sources and may contain later interpretation, but the strategic logic is convincing. Crassus ignores the Armenian route and marches into Mesopotamia. The decision ends at Kari. In 53 BCE, the Parthians destroy much of the Roman army using mobile horse archers, disciplined cavalry, and heavily armoured cataphracts. Crassus is killed. Thousands of Roman soldiers die or are captured. The defeat becomes one of the most humiliating military disasters in Roman memory. The famous Roman standards lost at Kari acquire symbolic importance for decades. For Artavasdes, however, the disaster creates an immediate problem. He has supported Rome, but Rome has just demonstrated that its armies can be annihilated. Parthian forces threaten Armenia, and there is no Roman army nearby capable of providing protection. Loyalty to a defeated ally may be admirable. It can also be suicidal. Artavasdes changes course. A marriage alliance is arranged between the Armenian royal family and the Parthian Arsacid dynasty. Artavasdes gives his sister in marriage to Pacorus, the son of the Parthian king Orodes II. According to a striking ancient account, the two courts are celebrating the marriage and watching a performance connected with Greek tragedy when the head of Crassus is brought before them. The scene may have been shaped for dramatic effect, and scholars still debate details preserved by classical writers. Yet it captures the brutal fusion of culture and power at these courts. Greek theatre, dynastic marriage, and the remains of a defeated Roman commander can occupy the same political world. Rome interprets changing loyalty as betrayal. Armenia interprets it as survival. The difference depends largely on where one is standing. From Rome, allied kings are expected to remain faithful to Roman interests. From Artavasdes' palace, the collapse at Caere proves that Rome cannot always protect its friends. The Armenian king must respond to the army most capable of reaching his territory. No single explanation fully accounts for every decision made by Armenian rulers during these years, but repeated shifts of alignment are not signs of simple dishonesty. They are often rational responses to a rapidly changing military balance. The same pattern returns when Rome recovers and once again pushes east. By the 30s BCE, Mark Antony controls much of Rome's eastern political and military resources. Rome itself is being divided by civil war, but Antony dreams of defeating Parthia and restoring Roman prestige. Armenia again becomes essential. Artavasdes offers assistance, and Armenian cavalry joins Antony's campaign in 36 BCE. The Roman invasion goes badly. Antony advances through Armenian territory toward regions controlled by Parthia and its allies. A large siege train is left vulnerable and destroyed. Supplies become scarce. Parthian forces harass the retreating army. Roman discipline prevents a disaster on the scale of Caere, but the campaign fails at enormous cost. Antony needs someone to blame. Artavasdes becomes a convenient target. Roman accounts accuse the Armenian king of abandoning Antony during the campaign. The full situation remains uncertain. Artavasdes may have withdrawn after recognizing that the invasion was collapsing, perhaps to protect his own forces and kingdom. To Antony, this is treachery. To an Armenian ruler who has already seen one Roman army destroyed by Parthia, remaining attached to another failing campaign may have looked like unnecessary sacrifice. In 34 BCE, Antony turns against Armenia. He invites Artavasdes to negotiations and captures him. The Roman action is presented as punishment, but it also reveals the vulnerability created by diplomatic customs. Kings must sometimes attend meetings because refusing can itself provoke war. Trust is limited, yet negotiation remains necessary. Artavasdes miscalculates. He is taken from Armenia in chains. Antony occupies parts of the kingdom and carries the Armenian king to Alexandria, where Artavasdes is displayed during a triumph-like celebration organized by Antony and Cleopatra. Later, after Antony's position collapses in the war against Octavian, Artavasdes is executed. His death is a grim demonstration of the limits of balancing great powers. For years he shifts between Rome and Parthia because neither side can be ignored. In the end, one of them decides that flexibility itself is a crime. Yet Armenia does not disappear. Artaxias II, the son of Artavasdes, escapes and gains Parthian support. He returns to Armenia and claims the throne. Once again, an Armenian prince uses one empire to resist the pressure of another. The pattern is becoming almost institutional. When Rome dominates, opponents of Roman influence look east. When Parthia becomes too powerful, Armenian factions seek Roman support. The kingdom's aristocracy participates in this dangerous game. Noble houses develop relationships beyond Armenia. Some possess cultural and family connections to Iranian society. Others recognize the economic and military advantages of Roman friendship. Loyalties can divide not only the court but entire networks of families. This makes Armenian politics increasingly difficult for any king to control. A ruler's foreign policy may create enemies inside his own kingdom. Supporting Parthia can strengthen nobles with eastern connections. Supporting Rome may empower rival groups. Foreign powers learn to exploit these divisions. They do not always need to invade Armenia immediately. Sometimes they need only support the right prince, recognize a competing claimant, or provide enough cavalry to change the balance of an internal struggle. The kingdom survives through alliances, but those same alliances are beginning to penetrate its political structure. A marriage can postpone a war, a hostage can guarantee a treaty, a foreign-backed prince can preserve a dynasty, and gradually, almost without a clear moment when the transformation becomes complete, the question facing Rome and Parthia changes. They're no longer asking whether Armenia should be independent. They're beginning to ask who should be allowed to wear its crown. Once the Armenian throne becomes a prize in the struggle between Rome and Parthia, kings begin to arrive with invisible armies behind them. Some are supported by Roman diplomacy, others by Parthian cavalry, and nearly all discover that a crown granted by a foreign power can be heavier than it looks. Armenia still has its own dynastic traditions and aristocratic factions, but the succession is increasingly shaped beyond the mountains. A prince who loses support at home may travel west and appeal to Rome. Another may take refuge at the Parthian court. Years later, one of them can return with soldiers, money, and promises of revenge. The throne at Artaxata is becoming a place where two imperial strategies collide through Armenian bodies. After the death of Artavasdes II and the return of Artaxias II with Parthian assistance, Rome faces a familiar difficulty. The Armenian king is hostile to Roman influence, yet a direct invasion is expensive and politically inconvenient. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, is consolidating control after years of Roman civil war. He has defeated Antony and Cleopatra, but he does not need another enormous eastern campaign merely to remove one mountain king. Rome instead begins relying more heavily on dynastic pressure. Artaxias II is eventually killed, apparently by Armenian nobles, and Rome supports the accession of his brother Tigranes III. The exact details of the conspiracy remain incomplete, but Roman sources naturally present the transition as a restoration of order favourable to Augustus. What survives suggests something more complicated. Armenian elites are not merely obeying instructions from abroad. They possess their own rivalries, fears, and calculations. Foreign support becomes useful because internal factions already exist. Tigranes III has spent years within the Roman world. This makes him attractive to Augustus. A ruler familiar with Roman expectations may be more cooperative, and his arrival allows Rome to claim influence without annexing Armenia. Yet the arrangement also introduces a recurring problem. A king raised or supported abroad may be viewed by local nobles as a foreign instrument. The Armenian aristocracy is powerful enough to make this perception dangerous. Royal authority still depends on cooperation with families controlling estates, cavalry, and fortified districts. A king cannot govern simply because an emperor in Rome has approved his crown. He needs local acceptance. He must distribute honours, protect inherited privileges, and manage rival noble networks. If he leans too openly toward Rome, groups with stronger Iranian connections may resist. If he moves toward Parthia, Roman leaders may search for a replacement. This creates a cycle of unstable reigns. After Tigranes III, the Armenian succession becomes difficult to reconstruct with complete certainty. Ancient sources provide names and episodes, but chronology is sometimes disputed, and royal titles can be confused across different accounts. Tigranes IV and Erato, members of the Artaxiad royal family, rule together or in closely connected reigns during the final decades before the Common Era. Their relationship as brother and sister, and possibly husband and wife according to dynastic custom, has drawn attention from later historians. Such unions were not unusual in some royal traditions where preserving dynastic legitimacy was considered politically essential. Rome, however, does not accept every Armenian ruler simply because the Armenian court does. Augustus attempts to influence the succession repeatedly. Roman-backed candidates are introduced, and military pressure remains available when diplomacy fails. Ariobarzanes of Media Atropatene is eventually installed as king with Roman support. He is not from the traditional Armenian ruling house. The decision may make strategic sense from Rome's perspective, but Armenia is not a province where governors can be transferred without consequence. Resistance follows. Ariobarzanes dies after a relatively short reign. His son Artavasdes succeeds him but is also removed. Rome then supports another claimant, Tigranes V, who has connections to the Herodian dynasty of Judea. The sheer variety of these candidates reveals how deeply Armenian kingship has entered Roman imperial planning. The throne is now treated as a strategic office. Rome searches for men who are loyal, politically connected, and capable of surviving in Armenia. That last requirement proves the most difficult. Erato returns to power during this unstable period, possibly alongside or after Tigranes IV at different moments. The details remain debated because the surviving evidence is fragmented. Coins provide important clues, especially when literary sources are silent or contradictory. Royal images and inscriptions can confirm that a ruler existed or shared authority, but coins rarely explain how a palace conspiracy unfolded or why a noble house changed loyalty. The disappearance of the Artaxiad dynasty around the beginning of the 1st century CE marks a turning point. The house that created the independent Armenian kingdom and produced Tigranes the Great has lost its secure hold on the throne. Armenia remains a kingdom, but the question of succession is increasingly international. Under the Roman Emperor Augustus and his successors, Armenia forms part of a wider system of client kingdoms along the eastern frontier. Rome prefers friendly monarchies in regions where direct provincial rule would require permanent military commitments. These kingdoms provide buffers, local troops, and political distance between Roman provinces and Parthian territory. On Roman maps of strategy, this arrangement appears elegant. In Armenia, it is anything but. A Roman-approved king may arrive with foreign soldiers. Local nobles may cooperate temporarily, then rebel when royal policies threaten their interests. Parthia can support another claimant, often a member of the Arsacid royal family. The Armenians themselves can invite foreign intervention when internal rivalries become impossible to resolve. Each crisis creates the conditions for the next. One revealing episode occurs during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Parthian influence in Armenia grows when a Parthian prince named Arsaces is placed on the Armenian throne. Rome responds not with an immediate legionary invasion, but through political manipulation. A rival prince, Mithridates of Iberia, is encouraged to challenge Arsaces. Regional kingdoms north of Armenia become involved. Local allies and mercenaries are drawn into the struggle. Arsaces is murdered. Mithridates becomes king. The method is efficient from Rome's perspective. A Parthian-supported ruler has been removed without a major Roman war. Yet Mithridates' reign is not secure. He is later recalled, imprisoned, restored, and eventually killed in another dynastic conflict involving his own family. His nephew Hadamistus seizes power through violence, reportedly killing Mithridates despite earlier promises of safety. Ancient accounts describe the episode with considerable drama, and some details may have been sharpened by hostile storytelling. Still, the broader reality is clear. Armenian kingship has become lethally unstable. Adamistus himself cannot hold the kingdom. Parthia sees an opportunity and sends Tiridates, a member of the Arsacid dynasty and brother of the Parthian king Vologases I. In 53 CE, Parthian forces enter Armenia and support Tiridates' claim. Radamistus is driven out. He briefly returns when disease and supply problems weaken the Parthian position, but Armenian resistance grows against him. The kingdom rejects a ruler whose violence has destroyed what legitimacy he possessed. Tiridates returns. By now the pattern is impossible to miss. Rome backs one claimant, Parthia backs another. Armenian nobles choose sides, sometimes according to local interest rather than permanent imperial loyalty. Kings rise and fall rapidly. Foreign courts speak of Armenia as though its crown can be assigned through diplomacy, while the people and aristocracy of the highlands repeatedly prove capable of rejecting rulers imposed upon them. No single explanation fully accounts for the instability. Imperial rivalry is central, but so is the weakness of succession after the Artaxiads. Noble competition matters. Geography matters. The cultural closeness between Armenian and Iranian aristocratic traditions makes our Sassanid candidates plausible in ways Rome cannot easily erase. At the same time, Roman military power in the West gives pro-Roman groups strong reasons to resist Parthian dominance. The result is a kingdom that remains independent in name while its throne becomes the most contested seat on the eastern frontier. And with Tiridates, the struggle reaches a new level. Parthia has not merely encouraged a friendly Armenian prince, it has placed the brother of its own king on the throne. Rome can tolerate instability. What it cannot tolerate is the possibility that Armenia is becoming an extension of the Parthian royal house. Rome's response to Tiridates is delayed, but not uncertain. The Emperor Claudius dies in 54 CE, and the young Nero inherits a frontier where Parthia has achieved something Roman policy has tried for decades to prevent. An Arsacid prince sits on the Armenian throne. To Roman strategists, this is not merely another dynastic inconvenience. Armenia lies beside Roman territories in Anatolia and Syria. A firmly Parthian Armenia could provide armies, routes, and political influence directly against Rome's eastern provinces. The question of one crown has become a question of the entire frontier. Nero's government sends Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo east. Corbulo is an experienced commander with a reputation for strict discipline. Ancient accounts describe him restoring order among troops who have grown soft during long periods of garrison duty. Weapons are repaired, training becomes relentless. Soldiers camp in severe conditions. Deserters and failures face harsh punishment. Roman authors admired commanders who transformed weak armies through suffering, and some details may be exaggerated to strengthen Corbulo's image. Yet the military preparation is real. Rome does not intend to repeat the careless confidence that helped destroy Crassus at Carrhae. The war that follows is shaped by Armenia itself. Corbulo cannot simply march toward Artaxata and expect Tiridates to meet him on an open plain. Armenian and Parthian forces understand the risks of fighting Roman infantry in the wrong terrain. They use movement, delay, and pressure. Villages and supplies become important. Roads through the mountains determine the speed of armies. Winter remains an enemy without political loyalty. Corbulo also uses diplomacy. Rome pressures neighbouring rulers and watches Parthian movements. Vologus is the first, the Parthian king and brother of Tiridates, faces problems elsewhere in his empire, including unrest and threats on distant frontiers. Great empires are rarely free to concentrate all their strength in one place. Rome understands this and pushes Armenia at a moment when Parthian attention is divided. By 58 CE, Corbulo advances. Tiridates avoids a decisive confrontation. Roman forces move through Armenia, attacking strongholds and attempting to break the network supporting the Arsacid king. Some Armenian communities submit, others resist. The sources are largely Roman and naturally emphasize Corbulo's success. But even those narratives reveal how difficult the campaign is. Fortified positions must be reduced individually. Cavalry moves through country where Roman pursuit is complicated. Artaxata eventually falls into Roman hands. Corbulo destroys the city. The decision is severe. Roman accounts claim the army cannot spare enough troops to hold Artaxata safely, so the ancient capital is burned. Military logic explains part of the action, but destruction also communicates power. A royal city connected to generations of Armenian kings becomes evidence that Rome can reach the heart of the kingdom. For inhabitants, the strategic message means homes, warehouses, temples, and familiar streets disappearing in fire. Tiridates withdraws. Corbulo continues south toward Tigranocherta. The city built by Tigranes the Great almost a century earlier. Its significance has changed, but its name still carries the memory of Armenian imperial ambition. The city submits to Rome after resistance in the surrounding region. Corbulo now controls the principal centres associated with Armenian kingship. Rome chooses a new king. The candidate is Tigranes VI, a prince with royal connections who has spent significant time in the Roman world. He is installed on the throne around 60 CE. Roman troops and allied forces remain available to support him. From Nero's perspective, the Armenian crisis appears close to resolution. Tiridates has been driven out. A Roman-approved ruler governs the kingdom. Corbulo has restored military prestige. But installing a king remains easier than making him acceptable. Tigranes VI acts aggressively. He attacks Adiabene, a kingdom connected to Parthia and ruled by Monobazus. The reasons are not fully clear. He may be asserting Armenian authority, following Roman strategic interests, or pursuing a local dispute. Whatever the motive, the invasion changes the balance. Vologases can no longer treat Armenia as one issue among many. A Roman-backed Armenian king is now attacking a Parthian ally. Parthia prepares for war. Tiridates again becomes the centre of Arsasid policy. Vologases gathers forces and pressures Rome to remove Tigranes. Nero's government refuses to surrender its position. Corbulo, now commanding in Syria, prepares defensive lines and strengthens Roman positions along the Euphrates. Then Rome makes a mistake that will become famous. A second commander, Lucius Ksenius Paetus, is given responsibility for operations in Armenia. Divided command creates rivalry and confusion. Paetus appears eager for glory and less cautious than Corbulo. In 62 CE, he leads Roman forces deep into Armenia, expecting to secure a decisive victory. Winter approaches. Supplies become difficult. Parthian and Armenian forces close around him. At Rhandaea, Paetus's army is trapped in a disastrous position. The exact military details are reconstructed from hostile Roman accounts that blame Paetus heavily, but the humiliation is undeniable. Parthian forces dominate the surrounding terrain and threaten the Roman camp. Paetus requests help from Corbulo, yet before effective relief can transform the situation, he negotiates. The Roman army agrees to withdraw from Armenia. The soldiers are forced to abandon their campaign under conditions Romans consider disgraceful. Ancient narratives describe the troops passing beneath a symbolic yoke, though scholars still debate the details of the surrender tradition. Whether every humiliating ceremony occurred exactly as later writers claim matters less than the political outcome. Rome has been defeated at the very place where it attempted to impose its chosen king. Tigranes VI disappears from the Armenian throne. Tiridates is once again the strongest claimant. The war has now demonstrated the limitations of both empires. Parthia can place an Arsacid in Armenia, but Roman armies can invade and destroy Armenian capitals. Rome can install a client king, but Parthian intervention can make that king impossible to maintain. Neither side can secure the kingdom cheaply. Corbulo returns to central command. In 63 CE, he advances with a powerful army and a much stronger negotiating position than Paetus had possessed. The Romans cross the Euphrates and prepare for renewed war. Tiridates and the Parthians also understand that another long campaign could be costly. Corbulo's army is disciplined, and Roman resources remain formidable. Armenia has already endured years of invasion, burned settlements, and competing rulers. The time has come for compromise. The meeting occurs near Rhandaea, the same region associated with Rome's humiliation. Tiridates approaches the Roman camp and agrees to remove his royal diadem. He places it before an image of Nero. The symbolism is carefully constructed. Tiridates will remain the Armenian king, but he must travel to Rome and receive the crown from the Roman emperor. Parthia gets an Arsacid on the Armenian throne. Rome gets the right to claim that the king rules through Roman recognition. Armenia receives something rarer than either imperial victory, a measure of stability. The settlement does not end Roman-Parthian rivalry, and neither empire abandons its ambitions. Yet the compromise acknowledges a reality created by generations of failed interventions. Armenia cannot easily be treated as an ordinary Roman client, and Rome will not accept its complete absorption into the Parthian sphere. The crown must somehow belong to both systems without fully belonging to either. After decades of assassinated kings, foreign candidates, rebellions, and invasions, the two giants have fought their way toward an arrangement that Armenian geography had suggested all along. Neither can take everything. The arrangement reached at Rhandaea is one of those political solutions that appears almost absurd until the alternatives are remembered. Tiridates is a Parthian prince, brother of the Parthian king, and a member of the Arsacid dynasty. He will rule Armenia, yet he cannot simply take the crown as a gift from Parthia. He must travel west, present himself before Nero, and receive the royal diadem from the Roman emperor. Persia supplies the dynasty. Rome supplies the recognition. Armenia supplies the throne both empires have failed to control directly. For the moment, everyone can claim victory. Tiridates begins the long journey to Rome in 66 CE. Ancient sources describe an enormous royal procession moving across the empire, accompanied by relatives, nobles, attendants, and cavalry. The journey takes months. One curious detail preserved in the record is that Tiridates, associated with the religious traditions of the Iranian world, reportedly refuses to travel by sea because of ritual concerns about polluting water. The exact interpretation remains debated, but the overland route itself becomes part of the spectacle. A king from the eastern frontier is crossing Roman territory not as a chained prisoner, but as a ruler participating in carefully staged diplomacy. Rome prepares to receive him. Nero understands theatre better than most emperors, sometimes to the frustration of those around him. The Armenian settlement gives him an opportunity to transform a complicated compromise into a magnificent demonstration of Roman supremacy. Tiridates is welcomed with ceremonies designed for public memory. Rome does not present the event as an agreement between exhausted powers. It presents the Armenian king as a man who has crossed the world to receive authority from Caesar. In the forum, before crowds and Roman officials, Tiridates kneels before Nero. Ancient writers preserve elaborate speeches for the occasion, but such speeches were often shaped by historians long after the event. The exact words remain uncertain. The symbolism is far more reliable. Tiridates removes himself physically beneath the emperor, acknowledges Nero's role, and receives the Armenian crown from Roman hands. The audience sees submission. Parthia sees an Arsacid-crowned king. Tiridates returns east with his position strengthened by both. This is the brilliance of the settlement. It does not solve the Roman-Parthian rivalry. It gives the rivalry a ritual form that delays war. Armenia becomes a kingdom in which Arsacid dynastic legitimacy and Roman diplomatic recognition can coexist. The arrangement is never written into an eternal constitutional law, and later emperors will interpret it according to their interests. Still, a principle has emerged from decades of conflict. Armenia may be ruled by a prince acceptable to the Iranian world, provided Rome retains a role in recognizing his kingship. The Armenian crown is effectively shared between two political systems. That does not mean Armenia itself is shared neatly. Tiridates returns to a country damaged by war. Artaxata has been destroyed by Corbulo. Other settlements and agricultural districts have suffered through invasion, requisition, and shifting control. Ancient sources report that Nero provides substantial funds for reconstruction. The gift serves Roman propaganda, but the need for rebuilding is real. Tiridates restores Artaxata, and some Roman traditions suggest the city is briefly called Neronea in honor of Nero. Whether the new name was widely used is uncertain. It does not survive. Armenian geography has a habit of outlasting imperial branding. The return of a stable monarch allows the kingdom to recover. Tiridates has strong connections to Parthia, but he cannot rule as a simple Parthian governor. Armenian nobles remain essential. The kingdom possesses its own traditions, sacred centers, and regional interests. An Arsacid king in Armenia gradually becomes part of an Armenian political environment distinct from the Parthian court that helped place him there. This transformation becomes increasingly important in later generations. Branches of the Arsacid dynasty will rule Armenia for centuries, even after Arsacid power disappears in Iran. A foreign dynastic house can become local through time, marriage, landholding, and shared political memory. The distinction between imported and native becomes less clear with every generation. For Rome, the Armenian compromise offers strategic advantages. A stable Armenia reduces the risk of direct Parthian access to Roman Anatolia. Rome avoids the cost of permanent occupation while maintaining influence over the royal succession. Emperors can still claim Armenia as a friendly kingdom. Roman coins and monuments sometimes celebrate diplomatic achievements in language that suggests complete domination, but imperial propaganda is rarely a neutral guide to political reality. Parthia benefits as well. An Arsacid ruler in Armenia creates a family connection at the western edge of the Iranian political world. Armenian aristocratic culture already shares many traditions with Iranian elites. Noble cavalry, court ceremony, personal names, and religious practices reveal deep Eastern ties. Parthia does not need Armenia to become a province if the Armenian king belongs to the wider Arsacid family network. For Armenians, the settlement provides space. That space is limited and dangerous, but it matters. The kingdom can rebuild institutions instead of changing kings every few years. Nobles can manage estates without immediately calculating which foreign army will arrive next spring. Trade can recover. Religious centers regain wealth. Villages damaged by war can return to the slower work of agriculture. Yet stability should not be mistaken for peace in the modern sense. The Roman-Parthian frontier remains heavily militarized. Syria contains Roman legions. Mesopotamia remains contested. Armenian nobles continue to possess competing external connections. A succession crisis can still reopen the entire conflict. The compromise depends on restraint from emperors who often become emperors because restraint is not their most obvious quality. For several decades, however, the arrangement largely holds. Tiridates' reign is obscure in places because the sources become less interested when armies stop burning cities. This silence creates its own historical problem. War produces detailed narratives. Stability leaves fewer dramatic records. The evidence remains incomplete. But the relative lack of major Roman-Parthian conflict over Armenia during parts of this period may itself suggest that the settlement worked reasonably well. A strange event late in the 1st century reveals the continuing vulnerability of the kingdom from another direction. Peoples from north of the Caucasus, including Alans, raid southward into the region. Tiridates reportedly fights against them and narrowly escapes capture when an enemy warrior throws a rope or lasso around him. He cuts himself free. The story may contain dramatic embellishment, but Alan incursions into the Caucasian and Armenian worlds are well attested. The episode is a reminder that Armenia does not lie between only Rome and Parthia. Northern routes through the Caucasus can bring raiders and migrating groups. Local kingdoms such as Iberia and Albania have their own ambitions. Armenia's strategic position is multidirectional. Even when Roman historians reduce the map to a contest between West and East, still, the greatest danger remains the imperial balance. By the early 2nd century, Rome is ruled by emperors with increasingly expansive ideas about the eastern frontier. The compromise created under Nero depends upon Rome accepting a king connected to Parthia. A Roman emperor who believes Armenia should be controlled more directly can simply declare that an Armenian succession has violated the old understanding. This is exactly what happens under Trajan. In 113 CE, a dispute over the Armenian throne gives Trajan an opportunity to intervene. The Parthian king has installed his relative Parthomasiris as Armenian king without securing Roman approval. To Parthia, the choice may seem consistent with Arsacid dynastic interests. To Trajan, it is an insult and a strategic opening. Roman armies march east. Parthomasiris meets Trajan and removes his diadem, apparently expecting to receive it back in a repetition of Tiridate's settlement with Nero. But the political world has changed. Trajan is not interested in repeating the old ritual. The crown is not returned. Armenia is declared a Roman province. For one dramatic moment, Rome abandons the compromise and attempts the direct control generations of commanders had found so difficult. The result will reveal once again that agreements between empires survive only as long as powerful men remain willing to remember why those agreements were created. Trajan's annexation of Armenia lasts only briefly, and that briefness reveals a deeper truth about the kingdom. Emperors can declare provinces, generals can redraw frontiers, coins can announce victories to people thousands of miles from the mountains. But beneath every imperial decision lies a country filled with farms, temples, market roads, noble estates, workshops, and villages that continue long after the official map has changed again. Armenia's history is often told through Roman legions and Persian cavalry, because armies leave dramatic records. The quieter Armenia is harder to recover, yet without it, the struggle for the kingdom makes little sense. Rome and Parthia are not fighting over empty heights. They are fighting over a living landscape whose people have learned to endure rulers arriving from several directions. Most Armenians never see Rome. Many never see the Parthian court either. Their world is local. A farming family may know the shape of one valley intimately where snow disappears first, which slope supports vines, where animals are taken during warmer months, and which road becomes dangerous when soldiers are rumoured nearby. Agriculture varies sharply with altitude. Fertile plains and river valleys support grain, orchards, and vineyards, while higher districts depend more heavily on herding. Ancient Armenia is associated with wine from very early periods, continuing traditions that reach far deeper into the region's past. Large storage jars buried partly in floors provide one archaeological trace of a society accustomed to preserving agricultural products through long seasons. Winter structures life. In the highlands, cold is not scenery. It decides when armies move, when animals must be sheltered, and how much food a household needs to store. A failed harvest can become more dangerous when roads are blocked. Villages must prepare for isolation. Houses in some regions are constructed partly with the climate in mind, using thick walls and spaces adapted to retaining warmth. People live close to animals more often than elite writers would have considered worth mentioning. Smoke, wool, leather, stored grain, and the smell of livestock form a more realistic background to ancient Armenian life than marble palaces. The royal court exists far above this ordinary world socially, but it depends completely upon it. Kings require revenue, and revenue begins with the land. Noble families hold extensive estates and exercise power across different districts. Later Armenian sources describe a highly developed aristocratic order of hereditary houses, and although the precise structure changes over time, the importance of landed nobles is already impossible to ignore. A powerful family may provide cavalry to the king, administer territory, and protect local roots. Its members may also rebel, negotiate with foreign rulers, or support a competing claimant. For a village living on noble land, the identity of the distant emperor may matter less than the identity of the local lord. Yet imperial war eventually reaches downward. When Roman troops march through Armenia, they require grain and animals. When Parthian-supported forces arrive, they require the same. Requisition can become organized taxation or simple seizure depending on discipline and circumstance. A field burned during a retreat represents strategy to a commander, to a household. It represents winter hunger. What survives in the record suggests that Armenian society is strongly shaped by mounted warfare. Wealthy nobles maintain horses and armed followers. The highlands and neighbouring regions are known for horse breeding, and cavalry remains central to Armenian military value. Aristocratic warriors influenced by Iranian military traditions can fight as heavily equipped horsemen. Armour, weapons, and trained horses are expensive, which means cavalry also reflects social hierarchy. A peasant carrying supplies for an army and a noble riding into battle belong to the same kingdom, but experience war in very different ways. Cities create another world. Artaxata, when restored after destruction, sits within trade networks linking east and west. Tigranokerta, though diminished from the imperial dream of Tigranes the Great, remains connected to regional commerce. Other settlements grow around fortresses, religious centres, and major routes. Merchants move wine, livestock, textiles, metals, and luxury goods. Coins from neighbouring kingdoms circulate alongside local issues. Languages overlap in commercial and administrative settings. Greek culture remains visible, especially among elites and in urban contexts. Iranian traditions remain equally deep. Aramaic has long served administrative purposes across the Near East. Armenian is spoken widely, but still lacks its own alphabet. This creates an unusual gap between language and surviving written evidence. The voices of ordinary Armenian speakers are largely absent because the scripts used for official inscriptions and documents belong to other linguistic traditions. The silence can be misleading. A people without a surviving written record in their everyday language is not a people without memory. Stories move orally. Genealogies matter. Noble families preserve knowledge of ancestry. Religious rituals repeat names and sacred associations. Local landscapes acquire meanings that outsiders rarely record. A spring, mountain, or ruined fortress may carry traditions invisible to Roman historians interested in campaigns. Religion binds these communities to both local and wider worlds. Before the Christian transformation of later centuries, Armenian religious life includes deities connected to Iranian traditions, but adapted within Armenian settings. Aramazd, associated broadly with the Iranian Ahura Mazda, holds an important position. Anahit becomes a major goddess with prominent sanctuaries and associations with fertility, wisdom, or protection. Mir reflects connections to mythic traditions of the Iranian world. Other deities show Hellenistic parallels. Yet simple equations between gods can be deceptive. Anahit is not merely a foreign goddess renamed. Cults change as they move through societies. Local traditions reshape imported religious concepts. Temples accumulate land and wealth, and priestly groups gain political significance. Sacred centers can become economic institutions as well as religious ones. One surprising detail preserved by ancient writers concerns the temple of Anahit at Erez, later known as Ariza. The sanctuary was famous enough that Roman soldiers under Mark Antony are said to have destroyed or looted a golden statue of the goddess. A later story claims that one soldier who obtained part of the statue became wealthy before meeting a grim fate. The tale is almost certainly shaped by moral storytelling, but it reveals the reputation of Armenian temples as repositories of extraordinary wealth. For local worshippers, such destruction is not an amusing anecdote about greedy soldiers. It is an attack on sacred order. This repeated collision between imperial armies and Armenian institutions creates a slow pressure on identity. People learn that rulers change. A Roman-backed king may be replaced by an Arsacid. A royal city may burn and be rebuilt. A temple can lose treasure. Noble families may survive even when dynasties disappear. Continuity therefore shifts away from kings alone. It settles into families, religious traditions, agricultural routines, and the landscape itself. This helps explain why Armenia remains recognizable even through repeated political disruption. The kingdom's institutions are fragile at the top but surprisingly persistent below. Foreign powers can replace a ruler more easily than they can reorganize every valley. Roman law does not instantly penetrate remote districts. Parthian court customs do not erase local practice. Effective government continues to rely on Armenian nobles and established networks. Trajan discovers this after annexing Armenia. His armies push beyond the kingdom into Mesopotamia, achieving spectacular territorial gains, yet revolts spread across the conquered east. Supply lines stretch dangerously. Trajan dies in 117 CE, before his new provinces can be secured. His successor Hadrian abandons much of the eastern expansion and returns to a more cautious frontier policy. Armenia ceases to be a Roman province, again. For the farmer in a mountain village, the change may arrive as a rumour carried along a road. The emperor is dead, the Romans are withdrawing, another king will rule, taxes may be collected under a different authority. Nobles who chose the wrong side will become nervous. Then the snow returns. Animals are brought down from higher pasture, grain is measured, roofs are repaired. Families prepare for another winter beneath mountains that have watched Roman armies come and go. But farther east, the political world is beginning to change. Parthia itself will not survive forever. A new Persian dynasty is rising, more centralized, more openly imperial, and far less willing to treat Armenia's divided loyalties as a permanent arrangement. The new danger does not appear suddenly at Armenia's border. It begins inside Parthia, where the Arsacid dynasty that has ruled the Iranian world for centuries is losing control. Parthian power has always depended heavily on great noble families, regional loyalties, and a royal house whose succession disputes can become violent. This loose structure has often frustrated Rome because defeating one Parthian army does not automatically destroy the wider political system. Yet the same flexibility also weakens the monarchy from within. By the early 3rd century CE, internal conflict, Roman invasions, and competing claimants are placing the Arsacid state under severe pressure. In southern Iran, a new dynasty begins to rise from the province of Persis. Its leaders will not simply replace one king with another, they will attempt to reshape the entire meaning of Persian Empire. Around 224 CE, Ardashir I defeats the last major Parthian king, Artabanus IV, in battle. Within a few years, the Arsacid Empire has collapsed in Iran. Ardashir establishes the Sasanian dynasty, named after an ancestral figure associated with his family, and presents himself as the ruler of a restored Iranian imperial order. The exact ideological connection between the Sasanians and the much older Achaemenid Empire remains debated. Later traditions often portray the new dynasty as consciously reviving ancient Persian greatness. But the evidence is more complicated. What is certain is that Sasanian rulers develop a stronger vision of centralized kingship and imperial identity than the Parthian system they replace. For Armenia, this is alarming. The Armenian royal house is itself Arsacid. The dynasty that disappeared in Iran still rules the mountain kingdom. What had once made Armenian kings useful intermediaries between Rome and Parthia now makes them potential enemies of the new Persian rulers. Armenian Arsacid kings possess blood connections, political traditions, and aristocratic relationships tied to the defeated Parthian order. To the Sasanians, Armenia is no longer merely a strategically important neighbouring kingdom. It can become a refuge for the memory and supporters of the dynasty Ardashir has overthrown. The balance has changed before a single Armenian fortress falls. Ardashir and his successors begin extending Sasanian authority across former Parthian territories. Resistance continues in several regions, and the transformation is not as immediate or complete as later royal propaganda suggests. The evidence remains incomplete, but Armenian traditions preserve memories of conflict with the rising Sasanians. Armenian rulers appear to resist the new Persian dynasty, possibly in cooperation with Arsacid loyalists elsewhere. This resistance is personal as well as political. For centuries, Armenian and Parthian aristocracies have been connected through marriage and shared cultural traditions. Noble houses on both sides of the frontier understand similar forms of mounted warfare and court behaviour. The fall of the Arsacids in Iran does not instantly erase these networks. The Sasanians must break or absorb them. Armenia stands in the way. The new Persian monarchy brings a more forceful imperial ideology. Sasanian kings use the title King of Kings and present themselves in monumental rock reliefs defeating rivals and receiving divine symbols of kingship. Their inscriptions name territories and celebrate victories. Zoroastrian religious institutions become more closely associated with imperial authority, though the relationship between church and state is complex and changes over time. Scholars still debate how centralized the Sasanian Empire truly is in different periods, and powerful noble families remain important. Even so, compared with the Parthian political order, the Sasanians generally pursue more direct control over strategic regions. Armenia immediately feels that pressure. Under Ardashir's son Shapur I, the Roman-Persian conflict becomes more intense. Shapur is one of the most successful Sasanian rulers. His armies campaign repeatedly against Rome, capturing cities and defeating emperors. In 260 CE, near Edessa, the Roman Emperor Valerian is captured alive by Persian forces. The event is almost without precedent in Roman history. A reigning emperor becomes the prisoner of the King of Kings. Sasanian monuments celebrate the victory in stone. For Armenia, Roman humiliation creates the familiar nightmare. A Western protector has suddenly demonstrated weakness, while a powerful Persian army stands much closer. Armenian rulers must calculate whether Rome can recover and whether Persian demands can be resisted. The answers change from year to year. During the 3rd century, Armenia experiences repeated political disruption. Sources are difficult to reconcile, especially because later Armenian historical traditions preserve events through texts written centuries after the period they describe. Roman and Sasanian inscriptions provide other perspectives, but neither side is interested in giving a neutral account of Armenian autonomy. No single explanation fully accounts for every royal succession and military intervention. Still, the broad pattern is clear. Sasanian Persia is determined to reduce Arsacid Armenia. At different moments, Persian forces invade. Armenian kings are removed or killed, and members of the royal family flee toward Roman territory. Shapur I's inscriptions list Armenia among lands connected to his imperial power. Later Sasanian rulers continue to treat the region as part of the strategic Iranian sphere. Rome responds whenever its own strength permits. The Roman Empire of the 3rd century is itself in crisis. Emperors rise and fall with frightening speed, civil wars divide armies, Germanic groups attack northern frontiers, provinces temporarily break away, plague and economic instability add pressure. In some years, Rome can send major forces east. In others, an Armenian king asking for help may discover that the emperor who promised assistance has already been assassinated. This instability transforms Armenia into an even more dangerous frontier. Under Parthia, the kingdom could sometimes rely on the old compromise of Arsasid rule recognized by Rome. Under the Sasanians, that arrangement loses its foundation. Persian rulers do not see an Armenian Arsasid as a convenient relative governing a buffer state. They see a surviving branch of a rival royal dynasty. The Armenian nobility is also divided by the new reality. Deep cultural ties to Iran remain. Some aristocrats may find cooperation with the Sasanians practical or advantageous. Others remain loyal to the Arsasid monarchy. Roman support creates additional factions. The mountains that once protected local autonomy now provide spaces where rival noble houses can maintain separate political positions. A king may control the capital and still lack complete control of Armenia. The Sasanians understand this. Rather than depending only on large invasions, Persian rulers can pressure noble families, encourage defections, and use local disputes. Rome employs similar methods. Foreign policy and internal politics become almost impossible to separate. One of the lesser-known consequences is the growing importance of noble military offices and hereditary power. Armenia's aristocratic houses are not simply wealthy landowners. They command forces that may determine whether a king survives. Later, Armenian tradition preserves titles and ranks connected with this political order, including the sparapet, the senior military commander. Certain offices become closely associated with powerful families. The crown requires these nobles. But their strength limits royal authority. This is the old Armenian contradiction, now sharpened by Sasanian pressure. The kingdom survives because power is distributed through local houses that foreign empires cannot easily replace. The kingdom is unstable because those same houses can choose different foreign allies. By the late 3rd century, Rome begins recovering some of its eastern strength. The Emperor Diocletian reorganizes imperial government and military systems. Roman forces defeat the Sasanian king Nasser in 298 CE, and a peace settlement strengthens Roman influence in Armenia and neighboring regions. Once again, the mountain kingdom receives breathing space because one empire has checked the other. But the world around Armenia has fundamentally changed. Parthia is gone. The familiar Arsasid network that once linked Armenian kings to the Iranian throne has been destroyed. In its place stands Sasanian Persia, an empire with a stronger political and religious identity and a long memory of the dynasty Armenia still represents. Rome has changed as well. The old republic that sent Lucullus and Pompey east is ancient history. Even the early imperial system of Nero and Trajan is transforming. Roman emperors now rule through a more openly autocratic court, command a reorganized state, and increasingly divide responsibilities across several imperial centers. Two new versions of old powers face each other. Between them, Armenia remains in the same mountains. Yet the kingdom is about to adopt something that will make the rivalry far more than political. For centuries, Armenian rulers have balanced Roman power against Iranian cultural influence. That balance depends on ambiguity. Then Armenia embraces Christianity, and ambiguity becomes much harder to preserve. Christianity does not enter Armenia as a sudden light falling on an untouched land. By the time the royal court embraces the new faith, Christian communities have already spread through parts of the Roman East, Mesopotamia, Syria, and probably into Armenian territories along trade and military routes. Missionaries travel where merchants travel. Prisoners carry beliefs across borders. Families move between cities. Soldiers return from campaigns with unfamiliar religious loyalties. The evidence remains incomplete, and the earlier stages of Armenian Christianity are difficult to reconstruct, but the kingdom is clearly not isolated from the religious transformation spreading across the Near East. Later Armenian tradition gives the conversion a dramatic centre. The king is Tiridates III, the missionary is Gregory, later remembered as Gregory the Illuminator. According to the traditional account, Gregory suffers imprisonment in a deep pit after refusing to participate in royal religious rites. Tiridates persecutes Christians, including a group of women associated with Ripsime. Before the king is struck by a terrible affliction, Gregory is released, the king is healed, and Armenia converts. The story becomes one of the foundational narratives of Armenian Christian identity. Its historical core is difficult to separate from later religious storytelling. The traditional date for Armenia's adoption of Christianity as a state religion is often given as 301 CE, allowing Armenia to claim the distinction of becoming the first kingdom officially to embrace Christianity. Many modern scholars, however, question the exact date and place the decisive conversion somewhat later, perhaps closer to the Roman Emperor Constantine's own adoption of Christian patronage after 312. Scholars still debate the chronology, partly because the main Armenian narratives describing the event are written generations afterward and shaped by theological purposes. The uncertainty does not reduce the importance of what happens. Whether the decisive royal conversion occurs in 300–314, or within a broader process stretching across several years. Armenia becomes one of the earlier states in which Christianity gains direct support from the monarchy. Tiridates and the royal court begin replacing or weakening older religious institutions. Gregory emerges as the leading ecclesiastical figure, and the Armenian church starts developing an organized hierarchy. For the people living in the highlands, conversion is not instantaneous. A king can change his religion faster than a village changes its sacred landscape. Temples associated with Anahit, Aramazd, Mia, and other deities have accumulated wealth, priests, land, and local traditions over centuries. Festivals structure community life. Sacred places are tied to families and regional memory. Christianization therefore involves more than teaching a new theology. It means transferring property, destroying or transforming sanctuaries, constructing churches, and persuading or compelling communities to abandon familiar rituals. Later Christian writers naturally describe the destruction of pagan temples as triumph over error. The people who maintained those temples left few surviving accounts of their own experience. What survives in the record suggests a process that includes both genuine conversion and political force. Gregory and his successors are traditionally associated with the founding of churches across Armenia. Some Christian centres rise near older sacred sites, a pattern found in many regions undergoing religious transformation. The new faith does not spread across an empty cultural map. It occupies landscapes already filled with meaning. One important consequence is the increasing power of the Armenian Church as an institution linked to aristocratic society. The office, later known as the Catholicos, becomes central to religious leadership. Gregory's own descendants play prominent roles in the early hierarchy, showing how quickly ecclesiastical authority can acquire a dynastic character in a world where hereditary status remains deeply influential. Christianity changes Armenian politics because it changes the language of legitimacy. For centuries, Armenian kings have operated within cultural systems strongly influenced by Iran. Royal names, aristocratic customs, religious traditions, and political relationships all connect Armenia to the Iranian world. The rise of the Sasanians has already made those connections more dangerous, because the Armenian Arsacid dynasty represents the old royal house overthrown in Persia. Now religion adds another division. The Sasanian Empire becomes increasingly associated with Zoroastrian institutions and royal support for the worship of Ormazd, the Middle Persian form of Ahura Mazda. It would be misleading to describe Sasanian Persia as uniformly intolerant. Policy toward Christians and other religious communities changes from ruler to ruler and according to political circumstances. Large Christian populations continue to exist inside the Persian Empire. But Armenia is different. An Armenian Christian community inside Sasanian influence is one matter. A Christian Armenian monarchy positioned beside Rome is another. Religion begins to look like foreign policy. This becomes especially dangerous after the Roman Empire itself turns increasingly Christian during the 4th century. Constantine's support for Christianity transforms the imperial religious landscape. Later Roman emperors strengthen the relationship between the Christian church and imperial government. Armenia now shares a faith with Rome while facing a Persian empire whose royal ideology is closely connected to Zoroastrian tradition. The division is never perfectly simple. Armenian Christianity develops its own institutions. Armenian nobles remain culturally connected to Iran. Some families resist Christianization. Others embrace the new religion while maintaining Iranian forms of aristocratic life. Christianity does not make Armenians culturally Roman. Yet from the Sasanian court, appearances matter. A Christian king in Armenia can be suspected of sympathy with Rome, even when his actual diplomacy is cautious. Armenian bishops may communicate with Christian centers west of the frontier. Roman emperors can present themselves as protectors of Christians beyond imperial territory. Religious loyalty creates networks that cross political borders. The same problem appears inside Armenia. Tiridates, the third and the early Christian monarchy, cannot simply assume that every noble house welcomes the new religious order. Powerful families have connections to older cults and temple wealth. Conversion may shift land and influence toward the church. Noble opposition to the king can take on religious meaning, while religious disagreement can conceal ordinary political rivalry. No single explanation fully accounts for the conflicts that follow. Faith is real, so are land, family, and power. The church itself also becomes a source of continuity when the monarchy weakens. Bishops and religious institutions operate across regional divisions. Clergy preserve networks that are not identical to the structures of royal government. This will become enormously important later, though no one in the early 4th century can yet see how far the consequences will reach. For the moment, Armenia's Christian rulers still possess a kingdom. Tiridates' successors continue the old struggle to manage nobles and foreign pressure. Persia remains powerful. Rome remains involved. The Arsacid monarchy is weakened by internal conflict, and Armenian noble houses increasingly act according to their own interests. Kings are deposed, restored, or murdered. Church leaders themselves become entangled in royal disputes. Christianity has not ended Armenian instability. It has made the stakes higher. The mountains are now filled with churches as well as fortresses. Crosses begin to appear in a landscape once dominated by temples tied to older gods. A new sacred history is being created, linking Armenia to the wider Christian world while gradually separating it from the religious identity promoted by Sasanian kings. This is not yet an irreversible break. Armenia continues to borrow from Iranian court culture. Noble names and customs remain deeply Eastern. Political alliances still shift. An Armenian king may be Christian and still negotiate with Persia, but the old ambiguity is narrowing. Rome looks at Christian Armenia and increasingly sees a natural partner. Persia looks at the same kingdom and increasingly sees a strategic danger. For centuries, Armenia survived by standing between two worlds. Now its faith has begun to pull the kingdom toward one side, even while geography refuses to let it escape the other. By the late 4th century, Armenia has become a kingdom whose greatest strength and greatest weakness are almost the same thing. The monarchy still exists, the church has become powerful, and the highland geography continues to frustrate foreign armies. Yet authority is spread across noble houses whose estates, military forces, and external connections make them nearly states within the state. A strong king can bind them together for a time. A weak king discovers that loyalty has limits. Rome and Persia understand this structure perfectly. After centuries of invading Armenia from the outside, both empires have learned that influence can be achieved more efficiently by working through divisions already present within the kingdom. The Sasanians apply especially intense pressure during the reign of Shapur II, one of Persia's longest ruling and most formidable kings. His wars with Rome dominate much of the 4th century. Armenia, positioned between the two imperial systems, is drawn repeatedly into the struggle. King Arsaces II, known in Armenian tradition as Arshak II, attempts the familiar Armenian strategy of maneuvering between stronger powers, but the room for maneuver is disappearing. Shapur wants Armenia firmly within the Persian sphere. Rome wants Armenia to remain a barrier against Persian expansion. Arsaces needs both empires to believe that supporting his throne is preferable to removing it. It is an almost impossible calculation. Relations inside Armenia are equally dangerous. Noble houses possess their own grievances against the king. Some resent attempts to strengthen royal authority. Others maintain ties to Persia. The Armenian Church, led for part of this period by the influential Nerses the Great, also emerges as a political force capable of challenging royal behaviour. Later Armenian narratives portray Arsaces as a deeply flawed ruler. Though these accounts are shaped by ecclesiastical hostility and written long after the events, scholars still debate how much of the dramatic portrait reflects historical reality. What survives in the record suggests a monarchy increasingly isolated. Shapur eventually invites Arsaces to Persia under promises of safety. The exact circumstances are uncertain, but the Armenian king goes. Like Artavasdes centuries earlier, he discovers that diplomatic protection is only as strong as the ruler offering it. Arsaces is imprisoned. He never returns to rule Armenia. Tradition places him in the ominously named Castle of Oblivion, a Sasanian prison associated with high-ranking political enemies. Armenian accounts describe his final days with considerable drama. The precise details cannot be verified, but his removal is historical in its consequences. Persia has eliminated the Armenian king without first conquering every mountain fortress. Then the Sasanians move directly into Armenia. Shapur's forces attack cities and attempt to impose firmer control. Armenian resistance continues under powerful nobles, especially the Mamikonian family, whose members hold an important military role in the kingdom. Musheg Mamikonian becomes associated with resistance to Persia and support for Pap, the son of Arsaces II. Pap eventually gains the Armenian throne with Roman assistance. For a brief moment, it seems the old pattern has returned. Persia removes a king, Rome supports his heir, Armenian nobles rally around the monarchy. The balance is restored. But the 4th century balance is far more unstable than the compromises of earlier centuries. Pap's reign reveals the growing tension between Armenian kingship, the church, the nobility, and Rome itself. He attempts to strengthen royal authority and reduce some ecclesiastical privileges. Later Armenian church historians treat him harshly, accusing him of crimes and moral failures. Roman sources also view him with suspicion. Separating political reality from hostile tradition is difficult. No single explanation fully accounts for the destruction of his reputation. What is certain is that Rome becomes uncomfortable with him. In 374, Pap is killed during a banquet organized by Roman officers. An Armenian king supported by Rome has been murdered by Romans. The event exposes the emptiness behind imperial language about protection. Rome wants a friendly Armenia, but friendship means obedience. An Armenian ruler who acts too independently can become nearly as inconvenient as a Persian-backed king. After Papadopoulos, royal succession becomes increasingly fragile. Varazdat, another Arsacid prince, is installed with Roman support but becomes involved in conflict with the Mamikonians. Musheg is killed. Manuel Mamikonian then drives Varazdat from the kingdom and exercises enormous influence over Armenian government. For several years, Armenia is effectively governed through noble power under nominal Arsacid royalty. The monarchy has not disappeared. It is becoming hollow. Meanwhile, Rome and Persia are moving toward a larger understanding. The Roman Empire has suffered military and political crises of its own. Emperor Valens has died fighting Goths at Adrianople in 378. The Eastern Roman government faces threats in the Balkans and cannot devote unlimited forces to Armenia. Sasanian Persia also has reasons to avoid a constant Western war while managing other frontiers and internal concerns. Both empires recognize a practical solution: divide the problem. Around 387 CE, though the exact diplomatic process and chronology remain subjects of scholarly discussion, Armenia is partitioned between Rome and Sasanian Persia. The greater eastern portion falls under Persian influence. A smaller western section comes under Roman control. The mountain kingdom caught between two empires is literally split between them. There is no single dramatic battle marking the end of unity. No final Armenian army stands on a field while two imperial standards advance from opposite horizons. The partition emerges from exhaustion, diplomacy, and the accumulated weakening of the monarchy. That quietness makes it more unsettling. For generations, Armenian kings have survived invasions, assassinations, and foreign interventions. The kingdom of Tigranes the Great lost an empire yet preserved its heartland. Tiridates survived Roman-Parthian war through compromise. Christianity created new institutions capable of linking Armenian communities across political divisions. But political survival requires a centre. By the late 4th century, the Armenian crown can no longer reliably provide one. Why does the kingdom fail to remain unified? Geography is part of the answer. The mountains protect Armenia from conquest, but they also strengthen regional aristocracies. A noble family controlling a fortified district can resist the king as effectively as it resists a foreign army. Imperial pressure is another cause. Rome and Persia repeatedly intervene in succession disputes and reward Armenian factions willing to cooperate. Every foreign-backed claimant weakens the principle that the Armenian throne should be settled within Armenia. Dynastic weakness matters as well. The Arsacid monarchy suffers repeated removals, disputed successions, and rulers dependent on external support. Kings increasingly struggle to control nobles who possess hereditary military power. Religion adds another layer but does not provide a simple explanation. Christianity draws Armenia closer to the Roman world in one sense, yet Armenian cultural and aristocratic ties to Iran remain profound. The kingdom cannot simply become Roman without losing much of what makes its society function, nor can it fully submit to Sasanian political and religious authority without resistance from the growing church. The partition is therefore not caused by one bad king or one lost war. It is the result of pressures accumulating for centuries. In Western Armenia, Roman authority gradually becomes more direct. The smaller Arsacid kingdom there disappears relatively quickly as imperial administration expands. In Persian Armenia, an Arsacid king remains for several more decades. The throne survives, but under Sasanian supremacy and with increasingly limited power, Armenian nobles continue to govern their lands. The church continues to organize religious life. The appearance of a kingdom remains. The structure underneath has changed. A line has now been drawn through the Armenian world by two empires seeking stability for themselves. Families, trade routes, noble connections, and church communities exist on both sides. The highlands have not divided themselves. Diplomacy has divided them. And yet the partition produces an unexpected consequence. When political unity fails, Armenians begin relying more heavily on forms of unity that armies cannot divide so easily. The kingdom is breaking apart. The culture is preparing to survive without it. The collapse of political unity does not produce silence. In some ways, it produces the opposite. Once Armenian kings can no longer reliably hold the highlands together, other institutions begin carrying the burden of continuity. Noble houses preserve military power. The church maintains networks across regions. Monasteries and religious communities become places where traditions are remembered. And in the early 5th century, Armenia develops a tool more durable than any fortress built by Tigranes the Great. It creates an alphabet. The figure traditionally associated with this transformation is Mesrop Mashtots, a scholar, cleric, and missionary living in a world where Armenia has already been divided between Roman and Persian spheres. Christianity has spread, but worship and education remain complicated by language. Armenian is spoken across the country, yet sacred texts are written in languages such as Greek and Syriac. Clergy may translate scripture orally for congregations. Religious instruction depends on people capable of moving between written languages and the Armenian speech of ordinary communities. This is more than an inconvenience. A religion without sacred texts in the language most people understand must rely heavily on interpreters. Meaning can shift. Teaching becomes uneven. Foreign cultural influence enters through the languages of scripture. In a kingdom already politically divided, the absence of a native writing system creates another vulnerability. Mashtots and the church leadership recognize the problem. According to Armenian tradition, with the support of Catholicos Sahak Partev and members of the Armenian elite, Mashtots develops the Armenian alphabet around the beginning of the 5th century, commonly dated to approximately 405 CE. The exact process remains partly obscure. Scholars still debate the influences that shaped individual letter forms and the extent to which earlier writing experiments may have existed. What survives in the record suggests a deliberate attempt to create a script closely suited to the sounds of the Armenian language. The result is revolutionary. For the first time, Armenian speech can be recorded systematically in its own distinctive alphabet. The earliest major project is translation. Biblical texts are rendered into Armenian, drawing initially from Syriac traditions and later corrected or expanded through comparison with Greek manuscripts. Armenian church tradition remembers the translation of scripture as an extraordinary cultural achievement, and later writers sometimes call it the Queen of Translations. Such praise belongs to religious memory, but even without devotional language, the importance is difficult to exaggerate. A written Armenian literary culture begins to expand. Clergy can be trained in Armenian. Religious teaching can move through the highlands with greater consistency. Historical traditions can be preserved. Theology can be debated in a language connected directly to Armenian communities, rather than always passing through Greek, Syriac, or Middle Persian. An alphabet cannot stop an army. It can make conquest less final. This becomes clear almost immediately because Persian pressure has not disappeared. The Sasanian Empire controls the larger eastern portion of Armenia, and the Arsacid monarchy there is becoming increasingly weak. Armenian kings remain under Persian supremacy, while noble houses compete for influence. The Sasanians do not need to destroy Armenian society to control the region. They need reliable political loyalty and a frontier that does not serve Roman interests. In 428 CE, the remaining Armenian Arsacid monarchy is abolished in Persian Armenia. According to later accounts, Some Armenian nobles themselves contribute to the king's removal because of conflicts with the crown. This is a grim conclusion to the aristocratic rivalries that have weakened Armenian monarchy for generations. Noble families may believe that removing an ineffective king will preserve their own privileges under Persian rule. The calculation works only partly. Persia replaces the monarchy with administration under a marspan, a governor representing Sasanian authority. Armenian noble houses retain substantial local power, but the symbolic centre of independent kingship has vanished. The dynasty that survived after the fall of its Sassanid relatives in Iran is finally removed. For the first time in centuries, there is no Armenian king. Yet Armenia is not culturally dissolving. Schools associated with the new alphabet as training clergy and scholars. Translations multiply. Armenian historians begin recording versions of the past that would otherwise be known almost entirely through Greek, Roman, or Persian observers. These works are not neutral modern histories. They contain religious interpretation, dynastic traditions, legends, political arguments, and memories reshaped by later events. The evidence remains incomplete, and historians must treat the texts carefully. But without them, enormous portions of Armenian history would be almost invisible. Writing changes the direction of memory. Rome once described Armenian kings from the perspective of Roman generals. Sasanian inscriptions presented Armenia as territory within Persian imperial claims. Now Armenian authors begin describing the highlands from inside their own cultural world. This emerging literary identity becomes politically important during the 5th century, especially when Sasanian rulers attempt to strengthen religious and political control. The most famous confrontation occurs under the Sasanian king Yazdegerd II. Persia is fighting pressures on several frontiers and remains suspicious of Christian populations whose faith connects them to the Roman Empire. Armenian nobles serve within the Sasanian system and provide military forces, but their Christianity creates doubts about loyalty. Yazdegerd's government pressures Armenian elites to accept Zoroastrian religious practices. The exact goals of Persian policy remain debated. Later Armenian Christian sources present the conflict as a direct attempt to destroy Christianity. Some modern scholars emphasize a broader effort to secure political obedience and reduce Roman influence. No single explanation fully accounts for every decision. Religion and imperial strategy are tightly connected. For many Armenian nobles and clergy, however, the threat feels unmistakable. Resistance forms around Vardan Mamikonian. The Mamikonians, already important as military commanders, become central to the rebellion. Armenian nobles divide. Some support resistance, others cooperate with Persia, whether from conviction, rivalry, or fear. In 451 CE, Armenian forces meet the Sasanian army at the Battle of Avarir. The Armenians lose. Vardan is killed. From a purely military perspective, the result is a Persian victory. The Sasanian army remains stronger, and Armenian resistance cannot destroy imperial authority. Yet Avarir becomes one of the clearest examples of the difference between winning a battle and controlling identity. Armenian Christian tradition remembers the fallen rebels as defenders of the faith. Their defeat becomes a moral victory in later memory. The rebellion does not immediately secure religious freedom, and later conflicts continue. Still, Persian efforts to impose religious conformity face sustained resistance. Decades later, another uprising associated with Vahan Mamikonian leads to a settlement in 484 CE. The agreement traditionally connected with Anvasak allows Armenian Christians greater religious freedom and recognizes important noble privileges while Armenia remains under Sasanian political authority. Persia retains the territory. Armenians retain the church. The compromise resembles earlier moments in Armenian history. But the centre of survival has shifted. Under Tiridates, survival meant preserving the crown between Rome and Parthia. Under the 5th century nobility, it increasingly means preserving institutions capable of outliving the crown. The alphabet becomes essential to that survival. Scripture is read in Armenian, saints' lives, histories, theological works, and translations circulate. The language develops a literary form shared across communities divided by local loyalties. Noble houses may still fight one another, but their children can encounter the same religious texts. Churches separated by mountains use the same alphabet. This does not create a modern nation in the modern sense. Ancient and medieval identities operate through religion, dynasty, locality, language, and social rank in ways different from later nationalism. It would be misleading to project recent political concepts backward. But something durable is clearly forming. Rome can annex western districts. Persia can abolish the monarchy. Noble families can betray one another. An army can burn a city. None of these actions can easily remove a language once thousands of people have learned to write it. The Mountain Kingdom has lost the political structure that once made Tigranes king of kings. Its rulers no longer control Syria. Its crown no longer stands between emperors as a prize of diplomacy. Yet the people of the highlands now possess another kind of territory. It exists in manuscripts, prayers, histories, and letters arranged in shapes created for their own language. The kingdom has been divided on imperial maps. The alphabet refuses to recognize the border. By the 5th century, the kingdom that once stretched towards Syria exists mostly as memory. Tigranes the Great is long dead. Artaxata has been burned, rebuilt, and overshadowed by newer centres. The Arsacid monarchy has vanished from Armenia, just as its ancestral dynasty vanished earlier from Iran. Roman emperors and Persian kings still argue over the highlands, but they no longer need to debate which Armenian prince should receive the crown. There is no crown to award. Measured by the usual standards of ancient power, Armenia has failed, its empire disappeared, its kingdom was divided, its monarchy was abolished. Yet this is precisely where the Armenian story becomes difficult to explain through ordinary ideas of conquest. The political state is gone. The Armenian world remains. Across the highlands, noble families continue to hold estates and command followers. Some houses disappear through war or dynastic failure, while others endure for generations. The Mamikonians become symbols of military resistance. The Bagratunis, who have already accumulated prestige within the aristocratic system, will rise much later to restore Armenian kingship in a different age. Other families maintain authority in districts whose geography makes distant administration difficult. Foreign empires learn repeatedly that controlling Armenia requires Armenian intermediaries. A Persian governor can issue orders, but roads still pass through lands influenced by local nobles. Byzantine officials may claim districts in the west, yet mountain communities preserve customs that imperial bureaucrats cannot replace quickly. The pattern established centuries earlier continues. Geography protects local power while preventing easy unity. The old contradiction survives the kingdom that created it. Christianity now provides another source of cohesion. The Armenian Church does not depend entirely on Roman or Persian institutions. Its hierarchy, traditions, and increasingly extensive literature give it a distinct structure. The Armenian language is used in worship. Clergy educate new generations through texts written in the alphabet of mashtots. Religious communities preserve manuscripts and histories. This independence becomes particularly important as theological divisions emerge within Christianity itself. The Roman Empire, increasingly known to historians in its eastern form as Byzantium, is not merely Christian. Its emperors become deeply involved in arguments about doctrine, councils, and ecclesiastical authority. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 attempts to define the relationship between the divine and human natures of Christ. Armenian church leaders do not participate directly in the council, partly because Armenia is dealing with the crisis that leads to Avrea in the same period. In later decades, the Armenian Church rejects the Chalcedonian definition. The theological issues are complex and cannot be reduced simply to politics. Armenian clergy engage seriously with doctrinal arguments, yet political circumstances matter. Acceptance of imperial religious structures can appear connected to Byzantine influence. Armenian Christian identity develops along a path distinct from the Church supported by Constantinople. This means Armenia is now culturally separated from both of its great neighbours in different ways. To the east, Sasanian Persia promotes a Zoroastrian imperial tradition. To the west, Byzantium supports a form of Christianity the Armenian Church does not fully share. Armenia is still between worlds. It has simply learned to remain between them through religion as well as geography. The consequences stretch far beyond the 5th century, when Arab armies destroy the Sasanian Empire in the 7th century and seize Byzantine territories across the Near East. Armenia again faces a transformed geopolitical order. Persia, the eastern giant that shaped Armenian strategy for centuries, disappears as an empire. Byzantium survives but struggles to maintain control of the frontier. New rulers arrive from the expanding Islamic caliphates. The names of the powers change. The mountain problem does not. Arab governors attempt to administer Armenia, collect tribute, and control noble families. Armenian princes cooperate, rebel, and shift alliances. Byzantium searches for opportunities to recover influence. Local houses compete with one another while claiming broader authority. The political behaviour would have been familiar to Artavasdes or Tiridates. Centuries later, Armenian kingdoms rise again. The Bagratid dynasty establishes a new Armenian kingdom in the 9th century. Ani becomes a magnificent capital, famous for its churches and strategic location. Other Armenian states emerge in different regions. After invasions and political collapse in the highlands, an Armenian kingdom appears far to the southwest in Cilicia, close to the Mediterranean, where Armenian rulers interact with Crusader states, Byzantines, and Muslim powers. Each of these societies is different from ancient Arsacid Armenia, yet they preserve the memory of an Armenian political world. The ancient kingdom caught between Rome and Persia therefore does not survive as an unchanged institution. Nothing does. Its legacy is more complicated. It survives as a pattern of adaptation. Armenian rulers learn to negotiate with empires without assuming that imperial promises are permanent. Noble houses develop ways of preserving influence through changing governments. The church creates networks capable of crossing political borders. The alphabet makes language portable. Historical texts connect later generations to earlier kings, saints, battles, and disasters. Memory itself becomes a form of territory. This is especially visible in the way Armenians remember defeats. Tigrayna's empire collapses under Roman pressure, yet Tigrayna's remains a symbol of lost greatness. Artavasdes dies after becoming a prisoner of Roman power, but his story survives. Pap is murdered by Roman officers, demonstrating the dangers of dependence on a supposed ally. Vardan Mamikonian loses at Avarea and is killed, yet the battle becomes central to Armenian Christian memory. Other cultures also transform defeat into identity, but Armenia's geopolitical position makes the process unusually persistent. Empires are often too strong to defeat permanently. Survival therefore requires interpreting loss in a way that does not make disappearance inevitable. A city can be destroyed and rebuilt, a king can be removed and remembered, a battle can be lost and given meaning. What survives in the record suggests that Armenian historical writing plays a major role in this process. authors attempt to organize a complicated past into stories of dynasties, conversions, betrayals, and resistance. Their accounts contain contradictions and legendary elements. Scholars still debate the historical reliability of many episodes, yet the existence of those debates proves something important. The Armenian voice remains present. Without Armenian texts, much of the kingdom would appear only at the edges of Roman and Persian narratives. Lucullus would invade a mountain country. Nero would crown an eastern prince. Shapur would claim another territory. The people of the highlands would exist mainly as objects of imperial policy. Armenian literature changes the perspective. The mountains acquire names. Families acquire histories. Foreign invasions become experiences remembered from inside the country. This does not remove mythology from the past. Historical memory is selective everywhere. Later writers may exaggerate unity, sharpen religious conflicts, or judge rulers according to the concerns of their own age. No single explanation fully accounts for the survival of Armenian identity, and it would be too simple to credit only Christianity, only language, or only geography. Survival comes from the interaction of all of them. Mountains make complete assimilation difficult. Noble institutions preserve local leadership. Christianity creates shared sacred traditions. The alphabet gives language a durable physical form. Repeated foreign domination teaches communities to separate political rule from cultural existence. This last adaptation may be the most important. The Romans often assume that political submission means incorporation into a Roman order. The Sasanians repeatedly attempt to ensure that control of Armenia produces reliable loyalty. Later empires will make similar assumptions. But Armenia has spent centuries learning that a ruler can collect taxes without owning memory. An emperor can control a road without controlling the stories carried along it. The ancient mountain kingdom disappears from maps more than once. Each time, something remains in the highlands waiting for a new political moment. The kingdom between Rome and Persia never solves the problem of geography. It turns geography into an education in endurance. The great armies are gone now. The legions that climbed toward Artaxata have vanished into history, their standards preserved in museums, reliefs, and fragments of old narratives. The Parthian horsemen are gone. The Sasanian kings who carved victories into stone no longer command the roads of Iran. Even the capitals they considered eternal have become ruins, archaeological layers, or names carried forward by cities transformed beyond recognition. The mountains remain. Snow still gathers above the valleys. Rivers still descend from the highlands toward lands that once belonged to rival empires. On hillsides, broken walls mark places where people watched for armies coming from the east or west. Beneath newer settlements lie older foundations, and beneath those may rest traces of kingdoms whose names were already ancient when Rome first turned its attention toward Armenia. History often remembers the largest power in the room. It remembers emperors because emperors commission monuments. It remembers conquerors because conquest produces records. Smaller kingdoms appear briefly when they become useful to someone else's war. Armenia complicates that pattern. For centuries, it is discussed as a frontier, a buffer, an ally, a rebellious dependency, a Roman concern, or a Persian possession. Every empire finds a new administrative word for the same difficult country. Yet none of those words fully explains what continues beneath them. People remain. They speak a language that eventually receives its own letters. They rebuild sacred places. They preserve stories of kings who succeeded and kings who failed. They remember battles whose political results seem hopeless on paper. Their descendants carry manuscripts across borders created by rulers who believe borders are permanent. Perhaps that is the quiet legacy of the Mountain Kingdom. Tigranes once tried to solve Armenia's vulnerability by building an empire larger than the danger surrounding it. The empire lasted only a few decades. Later, rulers tried diplomacy, dynastic marriage, Roman recognition, Persian alliances, and carefully measured neutrality. Each strategy worked for a time. None lasted forever. What lasted was the ability to begin again after the strategy failed. And so the final image is not a throne or a battlefield. It is a narrow road climbing through the highlands, passing ruined stone and disappearing toward a distant ridge. Armies have used that road. Merchants have used it. Refugees, priests, nobles, farmers, and scribes have followed its turns. Empires repeatedly reached the mountains, believing they had arrived at the edge of someone else's world. The people living there knew better. They were standing at the center of their own.